Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Professor X was called to save Loki? A special shout out to the original creator, Mikkeneko. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The thing about being director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and thus the de facto interface between the federal government and what the talking heads referred to as the superhuman community, was that it gave you certain resources. Resources that no reasonable person. He liked to think he'd been reasonable, once, in his right mind. He knew he hadn't been that in a while, would consider turning to. But the situation with the prisoner had gone from bad, to worse, to unacceptable, to critical, and this was the only solution to come out of his brainstorming session that stood a half chance of working. They had Jane Foster hard at work with all the funding she wanted and the best brains in the country to tap, but Fury had no illusions. This wasn't like in the movies, where science happened in a 5-minute montage and was done. They were months, or more likely years from having a functional Einstein-Rosen bridge of their own. No, they were going to need to deal with this on Earth terms. And so Fury pulled out his cell phone, the specially encoded, latest Stark technology that served as his contact with the non-secured network, and dialed the number in his address book that he never thought he'd need to call. The phone rang. And rang. It didn't go to voicemail. At last there was a click followed by a rattle. A series of noises that indicated someone had picked a handset out of its cradle. And honestly, this was the 21st century, who even had the old-style corded handset phones anymore? Someone who didn't normally need phones to communicate long distance, Fury supposed. Hello? The voice on the other end of the line was courteous, controlled, cultured, with just a hint of a New England accent. The speaker didn't identify himself. Fury supposed that if you had this number in the first place, you were supposed to know who you were calling. Nicholas Fury, director of S.H.I.E.L.D., Fury said brusquely. Ah, director, good to hear from you, the speaker said pleasantly. I trust that you and your people are well. No world-ending crises on your desk this morning, I hope. Fury glared at the file on his desk as he spoke. A situation has come up that we could use your assistance with, he started. To be more specific, it's a situation that we believe only you can assist with. I gathered that, or else you wouldn't be calling me. The speaker sounded amused. Damn him. What's the occasion? Fury hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Stark had sworn up and down when he'd given him the phone that its encryption was unbreakable. But Fury hadn't lived this long by trusting other people's assurances. This communication was over the public network, and therefore inherently unsecure as far as he was concerned. That meant that everything over a certain clearance level could not be discussed on such an open line. An extranormal incident occurred on May 17 over New York City, Fury began. Extranormal incident, that was how it had gone down on the report, if only because federal bureaucrats didn't like seeing the words, alien invasion, on their paperwork. A portal of indeterminate origination opened on top of what was formerly Stark Tower, admitting a number of xenomorphs as part of a hostile event. It got pretty messy. This was all part of the public record, and so nothing critical to reveal. Still, Fury had expected a bit more of a reaction than, yes, I know. We saw it on the news. Fury actually pulled his head back to glare at the phone in his hand, wishing that the old fool on the other end was enough with the times to have a video phone just so that his glare would transfer. And you didn't think to do anything about it? He ground out. I had my team assembled, ready to move in if the incursion spread beyond New York City. As it turned out, it was all over well before they could have possibly gotten there anyway. Not that I was in any particular hurry to send my people into ground zero of a nuclear strike. That was not part of the public record, and Fury swore silently at the stinging reminder of his greatest failure of the whole debacle. Even worse, in some ways, than the devastating assault on the Helicarrier. First he'd failed to talk the council out of that stupid clusterfuck of an idea. Then he'd let his own security protocols be violated. And then he hadn't been fast enough to stop the plane from leaving the tarmac. Stark and his team had managed to pull off a miracle, thank God, and turn a catastrophe into a victory. But Fury still felt his failure keenly. How the hell had news of that even leaked out? Given who he was talking to, Fury wasn't even sure he wanted to know. It was probably all down to some freaky mumbo-jumbo that he wouldn't be able to do anything about anyway, no matter what changes he made to his security protocols. Christ Almighty. With friends like these, who needed enemies? What about it? The voice prompted him, and Fury pulled himself out of his thoughts with some difficulty. Unfortunately, we're still dealing with some fallout from the incident, Fury said, the words tasting like ground glass on his tongue. Specifically, we have a prisoner in custody who was a hostile during the event. And damn it all, they didn't even want him. The crazy god was supposed to have returned to his castle in the air with his brother Thor at the end of the battle, because they sure as hell hadn't had the resources to contain him on Earth, not in the long term. Fury had even agreed to give up the Tesseract in the interest of getting the God of Lies out of his hair soonest. And here they were, no Thunder God, no Tesseract. A messy interdimensional diplomatic incident brewing on the horizon and no answers. There was a pause. When the voice returned, it had taken on a decidedly chilly tone. What exactly is it that you need from me, if I may ask? I thought I had made it clear when we opened this line of communications that I was not interested in participating in interrogations. I will not be a party to torture, Director. Actually, what I had in mind was more the opening of a line of communications, Fury said. Not that he was letting out the idea of torture if it were really necessary, of course, but right now it would be worse than pointless. The prisoner isn't human. Not one of yours, either, he added hastily, before the other man could start getting his defensive hackles up in the wrong direction. I was under the impression that none of the xenomorphs had survived. They didn't. There was a pause on the other end, one that Fury rather thought was more thoughtful. He'd at least got the man's interest. The Ether Asgardians, whatever they were called, were still not very well known on Earth, or at least hadn't been for the last 1,000 years or so. The public only knew about Thor, and had not yet made the jump to the idea that there was a whole race of them hanging over their heads somewhere. Fury would really rather keep it that way for as long as possible. And you can't communicate with him at all? Why not? He can't speak. Fury wasn't interested in explaining exactly why that was the case, not until he'd achieved a face-to-face conference in a nice, secured area. If Fury could have his way, he would have just ordered the man to show up in Bethesda by 9 a.m. the next morning. But the man on the other end of the line couldn't be ordered to do anything, not even by the US government. Or rather, especially not by the US government, since he and all his people were technically illegal just by existing in the first place. They couldn't be prodded by patriotism, since they had no reason to love the federal government. They couldn't be threatened, since they basically had nothing to lose. That left bribery, and that was always the weakest of Fury's persuasion skills. The more so since he didn't really have much that they wanted. Damn, Fury hated working with extralegal forces. Ones that weren't his own, anyway. Have you tried writing? The other man asked in a clinical, helpful tone. They had, actually. On the start of the second week, when watchful prudence had begun to more desperate. They'd put a pen and a piece of paper in his shackled hands, and he'd written with a speed that was somewhere between impressive and alarming despite the encumbrance. Fury supposed that was a skill you got when you grew up in a world where the keyboard had never been invented. Unfortunately, the mumbo-jumbo hand-wavy explanation Thor had given him about why they all spoke English apparently didn't extend to the written word, since the language he'd written in was completely incomprehensible to anyone on Fury's staff. The script reminded him vaguely of the flavor text he'd seen on the Lord of the Rings movies a few years back, but no translator programs had turned up anything like a match. Further attempts had yielded 2 other alphabets, one of which was completely alien, and the other of which Fury suspected would send a linguistic historian into gibbering ecstatics if the memos could ever be declassified, before their prisoner had grown frustrated and put the pen 6 inches through a steel table. Thank God for Hill's superb reflexes, the only reason he hadn't gotten her hand with it. Fury sighed. Believe me when I say that I wouldn't be wasting my time or yours if the solution were anything that simple, he said. For the time being you'll have to take my word that I think this is something that you'll be able to help with. If you'll agree to come in as a consultant, I can explain the entire situation in person. There was a long, thoughtful silence on the other end of the phone line. Once again, Fury cursed the technological ineptitude that didn't give him a view of the other man's face. So much was in the little details of expression and body language that simply didn't carry over the phone. Normally for a recruiting assignment like this one Fury would have just sent Black Widow, but she was in rehabilitation right at the moment and wouldn't have been able to fool her target for a moment anyway. In fact, no one could fool him for more than a moment. That was exactly why Fury wanted him. Even the world's best liar couldn't do much against a man who could pluck your thoughts right out of your head. "Very well, Director," the reply finally came. "I admit that the information you've so begrudgingly divulged has caught my interest. If you can send me your current whereabouts, I can arrange to be there by tomorrow." Fury winced, but he supposed it was unavoidable. "Not over an open line. I'll send it to the email we have on file for you. You do know how to work email, don't you?" A chuckle. "I could hardly avoid it with all the young students running through my house these days, Director. I hope it won't bother you too terribly if I make my own travel arrangements. I'm not willing to trust you with my location just yet." "Of course not." Fury couldn't help the regret in his voice. Another laugh. "I'll see you tomorrow, then, and you can explain things in more detail. Oh, and one more thing, Director Fury." "Yeah?" Fury braced himself to hear an ultimatum, or a demand of reward in exchange for services. You never knew, with these superpowered types, just where their ego would take them. "I do hope that your helicarrier has appropriate handicapped access." There was a click, and the line went dead. The X-Jet dropped him off in an abandoned lot in Selby by the bay. It was clear that they weren't happy about him going off by himself, without even one of the X-Men to serve as his backup. But Charles didn't want to expose any of his people to the discomfort. In some cases, a much stronger word would be needed than discomfort. They would feel it being in the bowels of a secret government testing facility. Even for some of his younger, less damaged students, there would be some inevitable friction when the mutant clashed with the human, and it was really better all around to just avoid that. He wasn't worried about his own security at S.H.I.E.L.D.'s hands. If this had been a trap for him, he would have sensed it coming, but this wasn't about him at all. Charles and Fury had put aside their differences and worked together in the past, and he felt confident they could do so again. Besides, if anything did go wrong, Charles was perfectly capable of getting himself out. He loved his students dearly, and they him, but sometimes he suspected they viewed him as a harmless, paralyzed old man who needed to be taken care of. Not a fighter, not a soldier. They'd never had need to see him otherwise, and Charles dearly hoped that they never would. Their sometimes overbearing worry was not offensive, really, and he did not spurn their true affection. But they could handle themselves without him for a day or two. If they could not, then Charles knew he had failed as a teacher. He was met at the empty dockside by a young woman in nondescript navy and black, with an unmarked car and a poker face. Out of habit, Charles brushed the surface of her thoughts, and found no animosity. Either she didn't know what he was, or she was one of the all too rare humans who truly felt no antipathy towards mutants. He could have pried further and found out which, but he didn't. Charles always minded his manners when he was among the humans, and it would be rude to poke around in her thoughts for no purpose other than to satisfy his own curiosity. He ascertained that she intended him no harm, and that her loyalty was firmly with S.H.I.E.L.D., and that was really all he needed to know. The agent took him on a circuitous route in a car with the windows tinted and shades drawn down. Charles allowed S.H.I.E.L.D. their minor obfuscations. At last they came to an empty airfield with a chopper waiting on the tarmac, and his chauffeur, bodyguard, helped to transfer him into the new mode of transit. As they lifted into the air, the metal and plastic cage thrumming heavily in the wind around them, Charles let his mind wander a bit. After his tantalizingly uninformative conversation with Fury over the phone last night, Charles had taken the liberty of conducting some investigations of his own. He'd gone to Cerebro, turning the power of the great machine on the location he knew concealed the helicarrier. It had taken some searching, but he'd found it in the end. And what he'd found? In Cerebro's vision, that 100 times expanded ghostly view of the world, normal humans appeared as gray. Some were more clear and solid in the vision, some less so, depending on their age and force of mental will, but they were meant to fade into the background if there was no trace in them of superhuman powers. Cerebro was built to isolate the exceptions from the rules, after all. Mutants, Charles's own kind, appeared in Cerebro in color. Those who were neither mutants nor yet powerless humans, Stephen Strange, for example, with whom Charles had occasional dealings, all showed up in their own varying ways, dim or bright or sometimes with an oddly tinted outline. If they showed up at all, many of them had ways to shield themselves from unwanted scrutiny. Whatever Fury had in his cells right now, though, glowed in the mental landscape of Cerebro's vision. The outline was blurred, the details indistinguishable, only a splash of vivid color distorting the space around him. Not human, without question. Not a mutant, either, for mutants were still humans at their base, no matter what other blessings or curses nature gave them. No, this was something other, and Charles was unable to fully make sense of what he saw, for it was out of the parameters built into Cerebro's senses. And yet, Cerebro, and Charles, for their powers come from the same font, was able to see him. Not human, yet not completely alien either, cousin races, still. Kin. Charles, who had devoted his life to the study of the emerging X gene and the advancement of Homo superior, couldn't help but wonder, if his own people were the next step in human development, was he looking at what waited several steps further down the road? It was not an entirely comfortable thought. Especially not if this distorted riot of color and thought and power was, as Fury claimed, a hostile. The pitch of noise outside changed, and Charles glanced out the window as the chopper descended onto the landing pad of the helicarrier. The poker-faced agent helped Charles onto the flat paved surface and guided him through the bay doors, and Charles couldn't help but notice the recent, hastily added access ramps placed strategically throughout the corridors. Really, and to think this was a government installation. OSHA would have a fit. He kept his mind open as they descended through the belly of the aircraft, brushing past the thoughts of the other SHIELD agents they passed. Not so much snooping as gathering surface impressions. For the most part the people here seemed unnerved by Charles's presence, but not half so unnerved as they were by the presence of the mysterious prisoner. Charles got fragmented glimpses of a thin looming figure in dark leather and armor, pale, with black hair and furious green eyes that radiated menace. Also, it seemed that the young man operating the commissary was a mutant. Charles probed a bit deeper as they passed him by, since the welfare of mutants was always his concern, but the young fry cook, powered to control milk, really? Proof that Charles hadn't seen everything yet after all, didn't seem to be in any distress, apart from the general tense wariness of a mutant going incognito among non-mutants. He was not part of Eric's faction, nor Charles's. He had chosen his post willingly, was not being blackmailed or coerced by any external factions. Just a young man going about his job in a chaotic world. Satisfied, Charles released his scrutiny and continued on. He met with Fury in a briefing room on what snatches of thought assured him was the detention block. As usual, the man radiated military aggression even when standing still. Feet set apart like a bulldog and shoulders thrown back with his hands clasped behind him. "Professor," he said curtly as Charles entered the room. His face was set and wary, carefully poker-faced, as though rigid discipline of his form and expression would be enough to keep his thoughts contained behind his skin. Charles smiled and didn't bother to disabuse him of this notion, extending a hand in greeting. "Director," he said, matching Fury's tone. Fury took his hand and shook it carefully, precisely long enough not to imply any rudeness. With the pleasantries over with, Charles sat back a bit and folded his hands in his lap. "Well, now that I'm here," he said. "Do you want to debrief me about this prisoner of yours? Or shall I go see him directly?" "Debriefing," Fury said with a grimace, and he waved Charles over to a conference table with a number of screens already set up there. "There was a lot I couldn't explain over the phone, and I think it's better if you know what you're getting into before we start messing around with him." And he launched into a clipped, precise report of the events leading up to and surrounding the alien incursion of Manhattan, now nearly a month ago. Much of it Charles already knew, if from a rather different perspective, but not all of it. He studied the video clips and freeze-frame shots of the subject at hand with interest. Loki. The file named him before Fury did, Loki of Asgard. Charles was never a classics major. His focus had always been on political studying biology and genetics, but he possessed enough background education to recognize those names. As well as the name of his apparent brother, Thor, who was listed in Fury's files not only as a friendly, but an active part of the Avengers initiative. Strange to think that men who'd lived and walked the Earth over 1,000 years ago could still appear on the surface of the planet as casually as popping down to the corner store. But then, Charles had made a living working with extraordinary things, and this wasn't all that much to adjust to. It seemed that not all of these strange beings from another time were hostile, then. Thank goodness for that. Although it did raise the question. So, Charles said casually as the flow of exposition dried up, why did you say that your prisoner couldn't talk? He seems to be talking up quite a storm in these video clips. There was a whole theme to his speeches that struck bitterly familiar notes in Charles's mind. He'd heard similar lectures on the inferiority of the human race from Eric's mouth often enough. Fury's lips compressed into a tight line, a flash of irritation passing over his eyes and then gone. I'm surprised you even need to ask, Professor, he said brusquely. Can't you just read the answer out of my head? I could, Charles said mildly, but that would be rude and unnecessary, since the entire reason you called this debriefing was to explain the situation here. He sighed. I'm not here to pry, Director. I have no interest right now in whatever secrets you do not wish to share with me. I came, by request, to work on a problem, which I can't do without all the pertinent information. Fury rubbed a hand over his face, and it didn't take a telepath to read the wave of exhaustion that rolled off him as he did. Sorry, he grunted, the apology sincere for all that it was grudging. We never intended to keep the prisoner on board the helicarrier this long. Actually, we never intended to retain him in captivity at all. His daddy wanted him back, and I was all too happy to pass him back into Asgard's hands and get him off ours. I surrendered the Tesseract to Thor to use to take them both back, since apparently their own local dimension traveling machine is still broken after Loki went on a tear up there as well. He paused for breath. So what happened? Charles prompted, when the pause went on too long. Since Loki appears to still be here, and Thor does not. At least, Charles had seen no sign of him when he went searching with Cerebro. And if his signature was anything like so bright and confused as his brother's, there's no way Charles could have missed him. Fury grimaced. We don't know for sure, he said. They left on schedule, vanishing right out of Central Park. Then an hour or so later, there's an almighty bang in the sky and down comes Loki. Falling right out of the air, made a hell of a crater when he landed, too. At that point there wasn't much we could do except scrape him up off the ground and put him back in his cell. Thor never came back, but our local Einstein-Rosen expert managed to put a call through to Asgard, a microportal wide enough to bounce a signal, but apparently not a body, and get hold of him for long enough to talk. We've got the recording if you want to watch, but it's not very informative. He basically only tells us that something went wrong mid-transfer and he's not sure what, and asks us to keep his crazy brother quiet until he can get back here and pick him up. He said he'd be back within 3 days. Fury paused. That was 20 days ago. We haven't been able to make contact again since. Ah. No wonder Fury looked harassed. Still, this was all very dramatic, but missing one crucial detail. So why, to get back to my original question, can't Loki talk? The only explanation he could think of was that the man, god, alien, whatever, was injured badly enough in the fall to put him into a coma. But that wouldn't explain why Fury had called him in. Even Charles couldn't have a conversation with a patient who was completely comatose. Fury's jaw tightened, and he took a breath. Charles's attention sharpened on him, and he caught the thought, he's not going to like this flit past, before he said in a hard, clipped voice. He can't talk because we haven't removed the gag. What? Charles's voice crackled with disbelief, and he mentally reached out and snatched the image from Fury's mind. Their dark-haired captive sitting in a cell, being led about on the helicarrier in heavy cuffs, with what looks like half of a metal mask enclosing the lower half of his face. He has to restrain himself before he digs any further. He had promised Fury he wasn't going to go poking around in his mind, after all. He tempered his initial disbelief and outrage, with some difficulty. You must have, at least for short periods, in order to feed him. Surely he had plenty to say at that time. Fury shook his head. You misunderstand, he said. We haven't removed it at all. We don't dare. Thor warned us against it in no uncertain terms. Said that Loki can perform magic if he can pass breath over lips, or something else poetic like that. He's a sorcerer, professor, like that strange character, or even worse since he's also a freaking Norse god at the same time. He can teleport, or phase through solid matter. And since we don't have any kind of magic blocking system in our cells yet, the only way to stop him from escaping is to keep him from casting any magic at all. How have you been feeding him, then? Charles asked, attempting to keep his demeanor civil. Intravenous. Fury barked a short laugh. Would be nice if we could. We haven't found a needle yet that doesn't bend instead of penetrating his skin. Or else we could just keep him tranked up and be done with it. Charles drew in a careful breath, trying to keep hold of his composure. It would not do to let their tentative alliance become so fragmented so early on. He and the X-Men had taken equally desperate measures, Charles knew, at times in the past. This Loki was an immediate and unquestionable threat, and it was only expected that he would prioritize the safety of his men, not to mention the public at large, over the welfare of his prisoner. No matter how his less trusting instincts screamed at him about secret government facilities and the mutants who had been disappeared there, mistreated and experimented and eventually used up and discarded. It was so easy to justify, after all, when your prisoner wasn't human. Don't ask me how he's lasted this long, because if we knew that we'd be putting it in a bottle and selling it. Fury was still talking. Asgardians are tough. We kept hoping his brother would come back and take him off our hands, or that we'd at least be able to get in touch with his people and ask for advice on some other way to keep him contained. The current measures are unacceptable, I'm sure you'll be the first to say, but right now we've got no other ideas. Fury looked him square in the eye, apparently undaunted by whatever expression was on Charles's face right now. That's where you come in, he said. Right now, the only source of information we've got on how to keep sorcerers caged is the sorcerer himself. Even if we could uncork the genie without him getting out of the bottle, there's the obvious problem of trusting any intel given to us by the god of lies. So you want me to interrogate him, Charles said flatly, to find out what weaknesses you can use against him. Fury made a frustrated gesture. I want you to do this to help him, he said. We're flying blind right now. He's gone 20 days without water. How much longer can he go before it kills him? How about food? What happened to knock him back to Earth when his brother took him up on the Tesseract Express? If we try to send him up ourselves, is the same thing going to happen again? And what in hell has gotten Asgard so distracted that they haven't come back to pick up their stray sheep? You think he would have any idea? Charles asked. He's been here the whole time. I dong regular updates from them. I think we can't possibly know less than we do now, Fury replied. Go pick his brain. See if you can come up with some better way to keep him from skipping his cell than wearing that smile piercing 24/7. We'll see where we can go from there. Debriefing done, Charles went down to the next level of the detention block. It took half an hour to get him cycled through the half-dozen top security containment measures built into this place. Charles wondered why they bothered at all, since Fury had apparently no faith in his own security to hold on to stray Asgard sorcerers. But then again, perhaps it was as much to stop others breaking in as their prisoner breaking out. Fury had given him an earpiece to wear into the cell, which struck Charles as somewhat redundant since he hardly needed one to communicate with him long distance. On the other hand, transmissions over the communicator could be recorded for posterity. Charles intended to use his own judgment on that matter. And then Charles set eyes on the god of mischief for the first time. Red. His first thought was that Loki was much smaller than he'd been expecting, which was ridiculous since the file quite clearly stated Loki's height as well over 6 feet. He looked smaller sitting down, perhaps, and there could be no question that superhuman constitution or not, the nearly 3 weeks of deprivation had taken their toll on him. His face was thin and gaunt, the skin drawn tightly over the bones of his collarbones and wrist, all that was visible under the nondescript cotton garments he'd been given to wear. Red. But perhaps the biggest difference of all was of attitude. In the pictures Charles had caught from the memories of his guards, Loki had loomed. He'd had a way of walking that stated the earth beneath his feet was unworthy of bearing his weight. He'd had a way of looking at you that sized you up and judged you less than a bug beside him, and a terrible, terrible smile that promised deeds great and fell. He'd looked larger than life, more than human, then. Bright. Not anymore. The prisoner was seated in a plain metal chair before a small table, both of which were bolted to the floor. His wrists were engulfed by shackles of an alloy unknown to Charles, although he thought it might have shared some properties with Logan's skeletal implants. A chain passed between both wrists, looping under the table to an eye bolt on the floor, preventing him from raising his hands above the level of the table. Sharp. Not that he looked all that inclined to try. He sat hunched in place, neither moving nor looking around in response to the opening of the door. His hair was a rat's nest, and his face pale and gray-tinged. His eyes, which had glittered so sharply in the videos, were dull and glassy and stared straight ahead unblinking. He twitched occasionally, the only movement of his spare frame. How long has this been going on? Charles wanted to know. He went non-responsive day before yesterday, Fury answered. One of the reasons we decided to call you in. Heat. Is all these really necessary? Charles muttered into the open channel. He's completely out of it. You could probably do away with all this hardware and he wouldn't be in any shape to make a break for it. Nope, Fury replied in his ear, his voice flat and practical. He could be faking it. No way for us to know. Not all of us have built-in lie detectors, Professor. Charles quirked a bit of a smile at that, although truthfully he didn't feel much like smiling at the moment. There was something about the atmosphere of the cell that was oppressive, in a way that was hard for him to pin down. If Fury hadn't admitted candidly that he didn't have access to any kind of magical or psychic dampeners, Charles might have suspected the presence of one of those. Something coming from the prisoner himself. Then, Fury had said he was a sorcerer? Was he a bit of a psychic himself? Red. Even right here in the room with him, Charles couldn't get a read on his thoughts, and he ought to have been able to. He could sense the man's presence without a shade of doubt, bright, chaotic and somehow twice as real as the humans surrounding him. But that gave him no sense of what was going on in the man's head. Charles put his elbows on the metal table and leaned into his hands, pressing his fingers against his temples in the habitual gesture that always helped him concentrate his mental facilities. There was something there, Charles could sense it, but it was faint and discordant, like a radio signal drifting just off the station. He tried to grasp those fleeting impressions, to bring himself in tune. Red. Glow. Metal. Bright. Sharp. Pain. Red. Heat. Pain. So what's the verdict, Professor? Fury's voice in his ear interrupted his concentration, and Charles grimaced as he opened his eyes. What evil plots is he hatching? I don't know, Charles snapped back at him, more than a little unnerved by his failure to get a clear reading. Can you open a book written in a language you've never seen before and read from a random page? Are you saying that you can't communicate with him? Fury demanded, and a tone of real alarm was beginning to creep into his voice. Fear-pain. Charles knew that calling him in had been Fury's last resort, and if he couldn't make a difference, Fury had very few other options. He'd either be forced to do something that would put countless lives at risk, or else take an action that could permanently jeopardize their relations with a dimension-crossing, ultra-powerful race of beings. The situation teetered on the brink of two potential disasters, and the chained, silenced figure in front of Charles was the linchpin. Give me some space to work, Nicholas, Charles said. He didn't often use the man's given name, but he wanted Fury to understand how serious he was about this project. No longer detached, no longer interested only in the abstract. For all the bright metal security surrounding them, bright metal, sharp metal pain, Charles knew he was sitting on an unexploded bomb, and defusing it was his responsibility. I've only been trying for 10 minutes. Fury settled down in a subdued silence, no doubt crouching over his monitors like a hunting animal. Charles blew out his breath, swiping a hand over his scalp, and tried to focus again. Charles didn't normally need to touch people to initiate a mental connection. Indeed, he didn't even necessarily need to be in the same room as them, although it was always useful to be able to get feedback from their reactions. Sometimes, though, it helped to focus through skin-on-skin contact, helped to anchor the link between one mind and another on the physical plane. Charles reached over the metal table and placed his hands on either side of the prisoner's head, settling his fingers lightly on the man's temples, and tried again. And the world around him dropped off to insignificance, as the cacophony of heat and darkness and blood and pain overwhelmed everything. No wonder Charles hadn't been able to read Loki's mind. He'd assumed his mind would be like a human's, or a mutant's, searching for the conscious sense of self contained tightly within the other skull. Loki's consciousness was like a mind turned inside out, thoughts and feelings and sensations scattered all on the outside while his self-awareness was buried within, lost deep in memories years past. Charles had been hearing Loki's thoughts ever since he'd walked into this cell, but he hadn't recognized them for what they were. Now he was plunged into Loki's nightmare, as deep and real as though he had been transported across the leagues of space and time. Darkness. Darkness of Nidavellir, the deep fastness of the dwarfs. Red. Red glow of the forge. Brock's forge. Bright sparks flying as the bellows blow. Heat. Heat of the fire, of glowing metal as it grudgingly reshapes under Eitri's hammer to form wonders. Pain. Pain of his hands, crushed in the clamp Eitri normally uses to hold a piece of metal while he works it, now used to hold him, keep him from running or fighting or doing anything to save himself. Fear. Panic at his own helplessness, knowing there is no rescue, there is no recourse, that this time he has gone too far. He tried to sabotage the great hammer that Brock is shaping, knowing it was meant for his brother, knowing it is the finest gift that Nidavellir has ever given to Asgard. Thor already has so much, overflowing with gifts and toys. Why should he get this too, such a magnificent weapon? While Loki gets nothing. But his stealth failed him, his wits deserted him. He is captured. Held, at the doubtful mercy of the dwarven smiths. The dwarfs are not a forgiving people at the best of times, but this trick, this sabotage, this vandalism is an outrage they will never forgive. Words bubble up in his mouth like blood. Threats of Asgard's retaliation, bribery, trickery, guile, hot spiteful insults, pleas for mercy. Words do not please the dwarfs, and when they cannot silence him with threats or blows, they turn to a more practical solution. A hot coal is picked up from the bed by a pair of metal tongs. Hard hands on his face, pushing him down, bending him painfully back over the anvil. Strong fingers pry his jaw open, holding his head fast despite his frantic efforts to jerk away. A cruel voice growls, "Your silver tongue is in need of tempering, Leesmith." Red and hot and pain as the coal is shoved in his mouth, burning his lips and cheeks and tongue, and he screams until his throat breaks and bleeds, but it can't escape his mouth past that pain. He needs to spit it out, to be rid of it, and his heels beat a frantic tempo against the base of the anvil as the struggles helplessly, mindlessly, in the iron grasp of his captors. He can't even turn his head. Silver needle flashes in the red glow of the forge and one holds him still, pins his head in place and his jaw closed as the other goes to work. Thick black thread to sew his mouth shut. Sealed shut. Gagged and bound and silenced, and no one will hear him. No one will ever hear him. Words and screams and blood and fire all bubble in his throat, but they can't get out. He can't get out. He can never ever get out. No one comes and he is trapped, can't speak, can't scream, can't. Charles wrenched himself free of the nightmare with a tremendous effort. A pained gasp escaping his lips as he broke contact with Loki and fell shaking back to his place across the table. "Xavier, what's happening?" Fury demanded in his ears, and the guards all look shaken and worried, as though they feel they ought to be shooting something but aren't sure where to aim. "Are you all right, Professor? What did he try to do to you? Report." Charles found his voice and spoke without taking his eyes away from the transfixed, glassy-eyed prisoner across from him. "Take off the gag." "Are you out of your mind?" Fury said sharply in his ear. "I've already told you why we can't." "Take it off him," Charles repeated more forcefully, and followed it up with a mental push on the guards that caused them to spring into movement, forgetting for several crucial seconds that the order ought properly to have come from Fury. One of the agents wheeled sharply towards the door, entering the codes to spring it, and hurried out into the corridor beyond. It seemed that the key, or whatever it is, was not in this same cell. "Now hold on," Fury protested. "Agent Johnson, stand down. I haven't authorized. Professor, you can't just order my men around like this. I told you, Director, that I would not be a party to torture." Charles didn't even try to disguise the edge in his voice. He did not normally have a violent temper, preferring to seek peaceful solutions to conflicts. But when his protective instincts were roused, they did so with an implacable vengeance. "We're not trying to torture him," Fury snapped in return, his voice deeply aggravated. "Everything we've done is in the interests of keeping him contained with a minimum of force. Torture might not have been your intention, Director, but it was certainly your result," Charles replied, glancing over at the door as it opened. "Your device triggered some sort of flashback, and he's stuck in it. I can try to bring him out of it, but it's obviously not going to do much good while the gag is still on him." "Hold it," Fury's voice barked over the intercom, not just Charles's earpiece. "Nobody move. Professor. Need I remind you that we have those restraints there for a reason? I'm not trying to cause needless suffering here, but we can't leave him free to use his mumbo-jumbo and escape." "I will endeavor to keep him contained in the meantime," Charles assured him. "I can block those parts of his mind that give him access to magic." "You can do that?" Fury demanded suspiciously. "Since when?" "Director Fury." Despite the tense situation, Charles couldn't keep an edge of amusement out of his tone. Need I remind you what I do with the rest of my time? With a school full of mutants in various stages of violent adolescence and post-traumatic stress running around, a regular part of my job is ensuring that those powers which pose a danger to others are kept dormant until such time as their owners have self-possession enough to control them. I have quite a lot of practice at it, trust me. There came a dark silence over the intercom, and Charles sighed. Director, this was what you brought me in for, he said. You were running out of alternatives. Fortunately, I can provide some. Now let's move on with this. You'd better know what you're doing, Fury muttered, and then the intercom flicked off. The agents guarding the cell jumped nervously a moment later, though, so presumably Fury only redirected his frustration onto them instead. One of the guards left. Two more came in. Some sort of unfamiliar rifle-style weapons unholstered in their hands, though not, thankfully for Charles's peace of mind, aimed at anything other than the floor. Oh, Charles added just before the door closed again, please bring us some water. Despite his bold words towards Fury, Charles was not by any means certain of his ability to control Loki's magic. It was different with mutants. Since their powers all sprang from a common gene, they tended to show up in the same place in every mutant's mind, accounting for individual differences. In a more general way, Charles could stop people from being able to do any given thing, given advance warning. The problem was, Loki's mind wasn't like a human's. Even as shattered as his thoughts were right now, Charles could tell that the architecture and the symbols used to frame thoughts were different from any mind he'd ever encountered. And he was not experienced with magic. He wouldn't know what use of magic looked like from the inside of Loki's head until he went for it, and then he just had to hope he was quick enough on the draw to block him. Of course, first he had to get Loki's consciousness back in his head, not blown out from here to Nidavellir. Charles turned his concentration Bami God, bending his mental powers back on him. He had no intention of plunging himself into Loki's visions again. Once had been enough, and the nightmare, fueled by Loki's panic and pain, was strong enough to drag him under and bury him completely. But that first contact had not been in vain. It had left behind a channel, a line as it were, that stretched between them. He worked on pulling Loki back along that channel, drawing him out of the lost places of his mind like he would draw a fish on a hook from a deep sea. Or use a lifeline to draw a drowning man from the water. Loki, he said, reinforcing his mental line of connection with a verbal one. Open your eyes. Look at me. You're safe. You are not in the fastness. The dwarves are not here. This is Midgard. He pulled the words from Loki's head, careless of how they fell from his lips as though they were part of his everyday vocabulary. These visions are not real. Let them fall from you. You are on Midgard, among the humans, and you are safe. For a given value of safe, anyway. Something thumped down on the table at his elbow, and Charles broke off momentarily to look up and smile at the agent who delivered the 8-ounce bottle of water to him. Oh, he said, much more water than that, please. She looked flustered, but smiled briefly back at him before turning to hurry back out. At last, Fury himself strode into the cell, a small bright magnetic code key held in one hand. He gave Loki a dark look, and Charles a much more doubtful one. I hope you know what you're doing, Professor, he muttered, before he reached over and with rough hands disengaged the lock of the gag and pulled it free, tossing it to the side. Loki gasped, wrenching himself sideways away from Fury's impatient hands. The moment he was released, he doubled over sideways and spat blood onto the floor. Charles observed the gag dispassionately as it hit the table. It had not, he agreed with Fury on this, been intended as an instrument of torture. It was made to fit over the jaw and lower face, extending inside the mouth to still the tongue. There were no hooks or spikes or sharp edges, nothing cruel. But neither had it been intended for long-term use. Its edges were hard and unyielding, and over the 20 days of wear it had rubbed lip and cheek and gum to bleeding ruin. The bright piece of metal was stained with splashes of bright blood and lines of darker, older blood all along the inside. Loki's mouth was in terrible shape, his lips parched and withered, his tongue when it lapped out tentatively to test its freedom left a well of bright red in its place. He looked no less lost, disoriented than before, but a little sanity began to return to his eyes. Loki, Charles said sharply, giving a little tug on their mental connection to pull Loki's attention to him. He met those green eyes steadily, feeling awareness slowly dawn behind them, feeling the tattered scraps of Loki's consciousness beginning to return to their rightful place. He helped as best as he could, pushing and pulling and guiding, but he dared not push too hard in such an unfamiliar pattern, lest he cause more harm than he helped. The grounding voice was just as important. "You're on Midgard," he repeated quietly. "You're not there anymore. You're among mortals, and you will not be harmed." "Will not be?" Loki's voice was little more than a croak, after 3 weeks of disuse. He blinked, his head jerking up and back as he seemed to fall into himself all at once, and looked around to take in the details of his cell. Whatever he saw there apparently did not please him, for he erupted into a towering rage. "Release me!" he shouted at the top of his voice, ringing painfully in the claustrophobic confines of the cell. "How dare you seek to bind a god? You brazen cockroaches! You meddle in things far above your capacity to comprehend. Release me at once, or I swear by the 9 you will know pain. You will know. I will hang you from a rock and call the crows to feast on your eyes, your tongue. I will flay you from the feet up and send the skins to your mothers, I will." For someone who hadn't used his voice in 3 weeks, he had admirable diction and range, Charles thought. He slipped a few times into what seemed to be another language, the words unfamiliar but their meanings glaringly clear. The SHIELD agents looked more than a little uneasy at this torrent of verbal abuse and threats, but a glance at their superior gave them no direction. Fury's attention and gaze was locked firmly on Charles. And Charles could hear, as they could not, the frantic undercurrent of panic and desperation running underneath the curses and threats. The desperate raging as he pulled at his bindings and found no give, no escape in any direction. To wake from a nightmare of captivity and pain only to find oneself in another captivity and pain was, Charles thought, not all that much of a trade-up. So he let Loki vent his rage and fear for a few minutes, let him run through his pent-up energy. He had few reserves and soon exhausted himself, slumping down onto his chair shaking in every limb. Charles reached out and twisted off the cap of the water bottle, pushing it across the table in reach of his hands. "Drink," he urged him. Loki's eyes snapped to the water bottle, and a burning thirst sprang urgently into the forefront of his mind. The fleeting thought crossed his mind to refuse it, but that was quickly pushed aside by the craving need for water. Without a word he snatched the bottle up in shaking hands and downed it in long, painful gulps. As Charles suspected, the bottle was quickly emptied, but fortunately just about then the agent appeared with more, a large pitcher of water and a plastic cup. Charles motioned for her to set it down on the table and then back away. He poured the first glass for Loki himself. Loki downed half the pitcher before he started to slow, the painful thirst finally abating. The phantom sensation of burning coals in his mouth, Charles knew, also slowly faded. His hands shook as he pressed them against his mouth, feeling for any hint of stitches. When he found none, he dropped his hand and leveled a steely glare at the nearest target, which happened to be Charles. "Better?" Charles asked him softly, well aware that the combination of pain and fear and rage that still stormed within Loki made him no less dangerous. Loki eyed him up and down, and his face pulled into a sneer. It cracked his lips and made them bleed. "How low Midgard's mightiest heroes have fallen," he said in a rasp, "that they bring cripples and degenerate half-men to do their work for them? The thing was about being a telepath, the thing was, you always heard people's intentions along with their words." Charles was quite accustomed to the stinging bile that came along with insults, the seething venom that bubbled behind taunts and slurs and sometimes behind polite smiles. He well knew the flavor of thoughts that hated and despised, and although the words were calculated to hurt, there was no true feeling behind them. They were tests, volleys thrown in the dark to test his reactions. Instead he heard, a flurry of disjointed thoughts like a swarm of minnows. Who is he? New, never seen before. Not a guard. Not a soldier. What does he want? What does he fear? Not a threat. Man of the mind. Scholar, doctor, mage. What does he know? How can I get at him? How can I frighten him? How can I make him want to help me? It was impossible to feel angry or insulted by someone who was obviously so afraid of him. "Oh, I'm not a superhero," Charles informed him calmly. "I don't even work for SHIELD, really. I'm here as more of a consultant." Loki's face stayed a stiff, hostile mask, but his eyes were confused and wary, off balance. The water had helped somewhat, but he was still swimming with exhaustion, mind and body both ground down by weeks of deprivation. Charles leaned forward and asked him, bluntly, "What else do you need?" "I need nothing from you," Loki spat, but his thoughts clearly said otherwise. "Food, please, please, please." Then over that primal need, forceful and clear, "I must not show weakness. I must not give them any openings, for they will show no mercy. I will not beg, not from them." Charles turned towards the hovering agent and addressed her cordially, "Would you mind bringing up something from the cafeteria? Anything they have hot would be fine." While that's waiting, he turned his glance towards one of the other agents hovering by the door. "If you could get one of the snack bars you hide in your desk, Jason, I'd appreciate that." The young man gawped and stammered for a moment, and after shooting a terrified glance at Fury, fled. He returned in just a few minutes with the foil-wrapped bars in his hands, avoiding his superior's eyes as he held them out. Loki glared at the unfortunate man for a moment, then at Charles, then at the bars. Then he snatched them, and tore the wrappings apart with completely unnecessary viciousness. His hands shook as he shoved the food in his mouth and bit down. "Does caffeine work on you?" Charles asked, mildly curious as he watched Loki devour the granola bars. He could feel the exhaustion pressing down on Loki's mind, dulling his awareness and leaving a gray fog over all of his reactions. "I could arrange for some coffee. I know you're tired, but I have a few questions to ask you before either of us go anywhere." Alarm shot across Loki's mind like a shooting star, searing bright and sharp. Questions, pain, was the first association that made itself known, an immediate synapse snapping into place. Then, "I don't know what they want. I know nothing. I have nothing. What can I tell them? What answers will they accept? If I scream convincingly enough, will they believe me when I lie?" "Thanks for the offer," Loki said from a dry throat, "but I believe I'll pass on your hospitality." Charles sensed it coming an instant before it happened. The thought of escape lit in Loki's mind, which had been until then too distracted by primal concerns of pain and food and water to think of such an abstract concept. Loki reached out in his mind for something dark and shining, words that formed out of glittering stars. They swirled into shape in his mind, waiting only for the motion of breath over lips. And Charles reached out and shut it down, pressing over the words like closing his hand over another's on a switch. Stopping motion, stopping use. It was harder than it usually was. Loki was strong, much stronger than the minds he usually dealt with. But in this one area Charles was stronger even than a sorcerer of Asgard. Loki's eyes jerked up towards him, widening in panic and horror as his magic failed to respond, as the glittering words fell and disintegrated half envisioned. "What did you do?" he hissed. "The condition of removing the gag is to make it no longer necessary," Charles said, calm and steady. "I'm sorry, Loki. But you can't go anywhere, not yet." Loki flinched backwards, lowering his head as though he would clutch it in his hands. The chains on his wrist jerked his hands back before they could rise above table height. And Loki shook his head, his eyes white-rimmed with horror. "You? How are you doing this? You're in my head. You? No, not like last time," his thoughts wailed. Ripping, tearing, twisting, not again, not again. Again, and wasn't that an interesting comment, for all it implied? But Charles had no time right now to pursue that thread, because Loki's breathing was increasing at an alarming rate, sliding towards hyperventilation as the demigod succumbed to another panic attack. Get out, get out. What Charles really would have preferred to do now was to back off, to withdraw completely from Loki's mind and give him the space he needs to calm down and regain his composure. He didn't like forcing a connection on an unwilling recipient. It was still an intrusion, no matter how careful he was not to do any lasting harm. But the circumstances didn't allow for that. Loki was still dangerous, still a prisoner, and if he wanted to retain any authority over Loki's treatment he had to demonstrate that he could keep him under control. So instead of letting go and pulling away, Charles extended his power further, spreading a soothing blanket over Loki's agitated, panic-churning thoughts. He pushed against Loki's stabbing rage and blooming panic with the same force he had used to contain his magic, lessening it, not completely, for such a lack would likely only imbalance Loki's mind further, but reducing it to manageable levels. Loki's tense clenched body relaxed as the panic attack passed off, his hands dropping loosely into his lap as his head tipped back up. He regarded Charles through slitted green eyes, hooded with a new respect and wariness. "Unexpected masteries," he said in that gravelly voice, "coming from a mortal like you." How did you come by it? Are you a sidemitter, one who seeks to pervert the forbidden sorceries to your petty ambitions? Cider, the arts of the volure, the holy women. Only a sick and twisted man would pursue them. Like me. He gave a dry laugh. Or is it something not studied, but born into you? He studied Charles narrowly. Half-breed? By blow of the veneer. Some Acer's bastard? Changeling, torn out of proper realm and place? Charles made a mental note that Loki spent an awful lot of time projecting his own circumstances and motivations onto others. No, both my parents were ordinary humans, he said, answering Loki's unspoken thought rather than his spoken question. My name is Charles Xavier. I'm a mutant. That is, he added when the word registered no recognition with the other man, a human born with some alterations to our DNA that give us certain abilities humans don't normally have. In my case, I have some small psychic abilities. A bit of an understatement there, but Charles didn't suppose Loki really needed to hear all the details. Loki jerked back as though he'd been snakebit. You hear my thoughts? He said, his voice equal parts startled and horrified. His mind howled a denial so vehement it was hard to break down into words. He can see through me. He knows my lies. Knows my thoughts. Open, vulnerable, unsafe. Never let anyone so close. Never let anyone see. Never trusted anyone with such secrets, and now he just reaches in and takes them from me? Yes, I can, Charles said evenly, not bothering to dissemble or soften the blow. His eyes flicked up to Nick Fury, simmering in the corner like an engine vibrating to be set free. Given your track record on truthfulness, Nick Fury asked me to assist with this interview, with the hope that it will make things much quicker and easier for all involved. Loki stared at him in horror as the implications began to creep in on him. Charles supposed he couldn't really blame him for that, but that was just how things were going to have to be. He needed some time to build up a more permanent block on Loki's magic, so that he wouldn't be able to make a break for it the moment Charles's concentration slipped. Another gag, this one only invisible and less cumbersome than the last. As much as it pained him, he didn't doubt its necessity. Charles gestured to Fury, signaling him to come forward and take over the questioning. Interview. Interrogation. However polite and civilized they were going to keep this conversation, there was no arguing that was exactly what it was. Charles concentrated on quenching Loki's anger and fear to manageable levels, enough to keep him lucid and in control of himself. Fury was all business, and if any of Charles's actions in putting a leash on Loki disturbed him, he didn't show it. He leaned forward on the edge of the table, getting almost into Loki's personal space, and growled, "Why'd you come back here, to Earth?" "Because Thor likes this realm and I wished to take it from him. Because somewhere there must be a people so weak and unimportant that they would bow to even me. Because I had no choice. Because that thought broke off and slithered away, leading off into curious blankness which piqued Charles's interest. On the outside, Loki's face curvedile. Why? I saw this realm just buzzing with disorder and I felt I just had to step in and put it to rights, of course, he purred. There was only so much I could take of watching your blundering incompetence before I simply had to step in and show you mortals how it was done. That was such obvious bullshit that Fury didn't even bother checking with Charles to see it was a lie. In any way hadn't answered the right question. I didn't mean then, he said brusquely. I meant, why aren't you up in Asgard after you left with Thor? We sure as hell didn't want you back, and if that was an escape attempt, it was the sorriest one I've ever seen. Loki's eyes flickered with temper. Rest assured, Director, that had I sought escape I would have found a much more efficient way of going about it. Just such plans flickered through Loki's mind, compulsively cataloging all the ways that he could have given his captors the slip from the moment the alien invasion failed. Right up until they put the gag on him, binding his magic, he'd been confident that he could have escaped at any time. So why'd you bounce? Fury demanded. To his surprise, Loki tipped his head back and let out a harsh cackle of laughter towards the ceiling. I bounced, as you so charmingly put it, he spat, because my so-called brother Thor is an imbecile that can't be trusted to operate anything more complex than a blunt instrument for smashing things. Stupid Thor, lazy short-sighted arrogant golden Thor. Why can you never once think before you act? Once again you leave me behind to pick up the pieces? The Tesseract? Fury prodded him. I thought that was your people's technology. Loki sneered. It was, he said. And so are your primitive vehicles your own mortal technology. And yet I doubt even you would be so foolish as to give the keys of a semi-truck to a toddler. Are you saying that Thor screwed up, and that's why you ended up back here? Fury repeated with disbelief. He glanced back at Charles, who responded with a shrug. Loki wasn't lying. He might be mistaken or lacking in knowledge, but what he was saying was the truth as far as he knew it. Travel using the Tesseract is hardly as simple as aiming and pressing a big glowing blue button, Loki explained, slowly as though speaking to a child or to the mentally ill. One must properly calibrate the probability field to accurately take the measure of what it is transporting. Otherwise, anything not specified in the field will be rejected. As I had the fortune to so spectacularly witness. I could have warned him he'd got it wrong, if he had asked me, if he had allowed me to speak. He knows what I am, and yet he forgot to take that into account, to change the spell to transport one Acer and one Jotun instead of two Acer, idiot. Charles's eyebrows rose at this last revelation, and he had a sudden suspicion they'd stumbled into something very important. You're not Acer, as Thor is. He interrupted. How did that come about? Loki and Fury both twisted around to stare at him, Fury with suspicion, Loki with horror and shock. There was such a spike of fear from Loki then that Charles could not have contained it if he'd tried. The file, Charles nodded at Fury. Mentioned that you and he were not related by blood, but it didn't say anything about you being a member of a completely different species. That's because Thor didn't mention it to us, Fury growled, and he sounded no small amount of pissed off about it. Obviously no one ever taught that boy the concept of sharing military intelligence. Or else he didn't think it was relevant, Charles murmured, studying the chaotic overflow of Loki's thoughts. Or maybe he preferred to protect his brother's privacy as much as he could. Well, that's great, but it means we have to rewrite all our assumptions, Fury complained. We'd built up a catalog of observed reactions when Thor was in the hospital during his first stay, but if this boy isn't even a member of the same species, we'll have to scrap our whole file and start over. Oh, what a trial that must be for you, Charles drawled, facing not one but two first contacts with representatives of an alien species. An anthropologist's dream. Fury only glowered at him. By this time, Loki had recovered enough to speak. No doubt it is welcome news, he said, heavy with the sarcasm. You need not readjust your assumptions at all. Asgard remains the Golden Realm unsullied, inhabited solely by heroes. The villain is only a Jotun changeling, after all, so what other outcome could have ever been possible? Jotun? Charles asked. Not because the word meant anything to him in particular, but because he could feel from the furious blot of dark rage and hatred in Loki's mind that it meant quite a lot to him. Frost giants, Loki spat. Beasts and monsters of Jotunheim, the scum of all the 9 realms. It must please you, mortals, to know there are other races out there even more degenerate than your own. And there was the hatred, the revulsion. The boiling venom, the wish to hurt. The hate behind which there was no love. Asgardians were no better than humans, then, after all. Where humans hated and despised mutants, Asgardians directed their hatred against other races. But that wasn't what hit Charles like a splash of cold water, that made his heart twist and his stomach sink. It wasn't Loki's hatred that shook him so but the doubling back, the hate that swallowed its own tail and became despair. It was a combination he knows well, a bitter poisonous brew that he had faced many times before, in many other minds. Loki was a frost giant, it was himself that he hated. Charles had seen that hatred countless times since he started his project of gathering young mutants, of making his school a refuge where they could flee the torments of the human world, rest, and learn about themselves. Internalized racism, his notes called it, but that was a cold and clinical phrase for the storm of grief and rage and terror and pain that Charles has read in the minds and hearts of far too many children. Hatred against mutants was ingrained in human culture, embedded. Even parents who considered themselves tolerant and accepting, even the very few who actually were, couldn't shield their children from outpouring of derision and disgust that assailed them from every angle. That kind of conditioning couldn't help but leave scars, once the truth was known. It sometimes took years of careful and patient work to coax his students out of that mindset, to bring them to a place where they could learn to accept their fellows and take pride in their true selves. Some of them never could. Others went too far in the opposite direction, turned their hatred inside out and directed it against the humans instead. Some of them left Charles and went on to Eric, joining his cause instead. And it grieved Charles each and every time it happened. It was a failure whose sting never lessened, but he kept trying, all the same. Up until now he'd kept a part of himself detached from the proceedings, sympathetic yet clinical, not invested. He was invested now, and he knew that he could no more walk away from Loki than he could have from Jean, or Scott, or Kitty, or Kurt, or any of the other students that had, over the years, put their faith in him. He'd find a way to help Loki. Not to escape captivity, certainly. That would be a short-sighted and ultimately counterproductive exercise, when Loki returned to vent his rage on his former captors. But in some better way. Help him find peace within himself, maybe, so that when the time came he could be trusted with freedom. Help him to be able to be free, inside and out. Meanwhile, Fury was asking another question. Running down the list, no doubt, of questions he'd put to Charles in the all-too unprepared briefing from this morning. I said, he growled, why haven't they come back for you? They're 2.5 weeks late for your scheduled pickup. Any ideas what could be keeping them? I haven't the faintest idea, I'm afraid, Loki said in a mind erupted in a scream of anguished fury. They don't want me, they don't need me, not their son, not brother, not prince, not even one of them. Cast out, abandoned, rejected, left behind, they'd rather leave me here to be eaten slowly by rats on Midgard than even want to look at me. Loki tilted his head to the side and his lips curled up in what could, generously, be described as a smile. Are your precious new Asgard allies letting you down already? You really should not put your trust in princes, you know. Did you not wonder why they ignored you all these years, until you so happened to uncover something of interest to them? His voice held the faintest of tremors. They'll treat with you only so long as you have something they need, and then they'll drop you in the gutter like the worthless, miserable animals that you are. Definitely projecting, Charles thought, as he slapped hard on another uncontrollable swell of emotion. Grief and pain and resentment and heartbreak. This was getting out of hand. Charles was not an empath, was not really equipped to deal with specific emotions, not like Donnie or Hope. He could do it as an extension of his mental powers, but it wasn't really his forte. He much preferred dealing with the root causes of such self-destructive mental schema, than handling their symptoms piecemeal. Charles sighed and rubbed a hand over his eyes. Somehow he'd gotten himself sucked right into the situation he swore he wouldn't, standing by and lending his powers to the interrogation of a hostile prisoner. He frowned and let his eye fall on Fury's back, leaning over the table towards Loki and growling out his words. A reassessment of the situation was definitely called for. Movement outside the cell door attracted his attention. He glanced over that direction and saw the young man he'd sent off to get food for Loki, hovering by the doorway with a tray in his hands. Well, that had taken long enough, although now the timing seemed auspicious. Director, he said, interrupting Fury mid-sentence. The tall, one-eyed man twisted back and glowered at him. Why don't we take a little break? Fury hesitated, the reluctance to leave off the questioning now that they'd finally gotten a break writ plain on his face. Some issues have come up that I'd like to discuss with you, Charles added, and Fury acquiesced with a grudging sigh. The hard determination to get as much information out of his prisoner as he could battled with the desire to get out of the room before he gave in to a not completely incomprehensible yet highly unprofessional desire to strangle his prisoner for all the cheek he was getting from him. The two of them filed out of the cell, passing by the tray bearing guard on their way. The meal seemed to be hamburger stroganoff, and included no cutlery except a flimsy plastic spoon, a bit pointless, in Charles's opinion. If Loki's hands were free and he decided to attack, he could kill them with his bare hands with no need of a weapon. If they weren't and he didn't, then they might as well at least give him a fork. But that was Fury's operation all over. Conscientious paranoia in the smallest of details. While overlooking some of the rather more major ones. He'd have to see what he could do about that. Now was not, perhaps, the time to push for Loki's unbinding, but that would come in time. All right, Professor, what's this about? Fury asked after the heavy, airlock-quality door slid shut behind them. Xavier shook his head. Not here, Director. He's still listening. The hell he is. Fury shot a doubtful look through the vacuum-layered glass of the one-way observation window at their prisoner. He certainly didn't look like he was paying them any attention, concentrating instead on figuring out how to eat with his hands chained. That whole cell is completely soundproof. Xavier sighed. Soundproof for humans, maybe, he said. Acer, or Jodin, as the case may be, have somewhat more sensitive hearing. Trust me. He can hear us. Shall we retire elsewhere? Loki abandoned his intense concentration on the plastic spoon long enough to shoot them both a poisonous glare at being found out. Apparently, one-way mirrors didn't work on Jodin's either, before turning his back on them in what could only be described as a massive sulk. Fury blew out his breath, and with a jerk of his head indicated the direction down the corridor behind them. Damn aliens and their damn supernatural senses. They fetched up in the same conference room as before, when Fury had given Xavier the debriefing, which he now recognized with some annoyance as having some major holes in the intel. But how the hell was he supposed to know about Loki? Why'd you cut the interview short? Fury said, turning to Xavier as he accessed the security monitors from the holding cell. Loki was currently attending to the tray of food they'd given him. The chains on his wrists meant he couldn't bring his hands up to his face, and had to hunch down almost to the level of the table to be able to eat. Because Loki was growing increasingly exhausted and unstable, Xavier replied. He'd pulled a notebook out of somewhere, seriously, who still used paper notebooks in the 2010s, and was making some rapid notes on it. It's best to give him some time to eat, wash and rest before continuing. Fury raised his eyebrows. He seemed fine to me, he said. Insolent little bastard, full of sass. He only seemed coherent to you because I was actively suppressing his feelings of anger and fear, Xavier said, making more notes. But that will only go so far as a short-term solution. Fury's eyebrows raised even further as the implications of this unexpected ability sank in. Didn't know you could do that, he mused. Speaking of long-term solutions, isn't there any way you could make that permanent? Take away his anger and hate completely? A Loki without his anger issues or epic grudges would be a hell of a lot easier to manage, that was for sure. Xavier snapped his notebook shut, and gave Fury a cool look it took him a moment to decipher as utterly calm fury. Yes, he said, yes, he would be. And as long as we're discussing long-term solutions, why not simply chop off both his arms at the elbow? That would also render him much more manageable, and the degree of mutilation would be about the same. The hair stood up on the back of his neck, and despite himself Fury couldn't help the nausea that rose unbidden at the mental images the mild-sounding suggestion conjured. Loki, huddled in a corner stained with his own blood, arms and legs ending in stumps. Fury has seen many terrible things in his career, and done many things that were arguably terrible. But not that. Never that. Not even to Loki. That's not how we do things, he told Xavier, and it took a lot of effort to keep his voice steady. Wasted effort, really, because he knew perfectly well that Xavier can see right through him like a pane of glass. Xavier gave him another of those looks, and then his expression cleared slightly. I'm glad to hear you say that, Director, he said. Particularly because if you had not said that, and meant it, I would have been obliged to remove Loki from your custody. What? Fury choked out, feeling his eyes nearly bugging out from his head. Now, hold on just a minute here. You don't have the authority to. Must I remind you again that I don't work for you? Xavier said sharply. You brought me in as an outside consultant, and that's exactly what I am. And if you continue to mishandle Loki's situation, I will take him over from you. In what way am I mishandling the situation? Fury demanded, wondering how the hell he gone from being the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. to feeling like a little boy being called to task by one of his tutors. We've got him completely under control. Under control, Xavier said, and sighed. Director, I understand that you've had a very stressful couple of weeks. Xavier had no idea, Fury thought. Starting with the colossal fuck-up that was Banner's rampage in Harlem, continuing on through Thor's crash landing in New Mexico and leading right on into that crazy Russian scientist trashing the Stark Expo and then to this entire fiasco with the Tesseract ever since. Fury couldn't even remember the last time he'd gotten a full night's sleep. But you are, once again, looking only at short-term solutions, Xavier continued. You're failing to consider a very critical piece of information. Which is what? Fury said belligerently. That Loki is functionally immortal. Xavier opened the notebook and set it on the table, his fingers tapping against something that looked like quick arithmetic calculation. Loki is still a young man by the standards of his people. From what I can gather, his father is over 7,000 years old and has been king for most of that time. That's as long as the span of all of recorded history. So right now you have him under control. Can you guarantee that you'll be able to keep him that way for a month? A year? 10 years? 100? Can you guarantee that in all that time there will be no disasters? No changes in command or policy? Nothing that will crack the iron grip of control you're so proud of? Fury shifted uneasily, but didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was all too plain in his mind. Xavier continued remorselessly, he may not have had a reason to hate us before, but we're certainly giving him plenty of reasons now. Sooner or later he will be free, Director, and when that happens what will you do if he gets out and comes back for us? Mad with pain and carrying a grudge against the entire human race for the way we've treated him? He paused for a moment and waited, but when Fury made no comment he went on. If we aren't going to kill him, then we have to find some way to seek reconciliation, because this is not a problem that is going to go away if you leave it in a cell for long enough. Between execution and rehabilitation there is, in the long run, no middle ground. Excuse me, Fury said, I'm not particularly interested in his rehabilitation. And I haven't completely let out execution as an option, he couldn't help but think. Xavier gave a thin smile. Perhaps you haven't, he said mildly. But there's always Asgard to consider. Director, I don't know any more about Asgard than you do. But I have seen Loki's mind. He doesn't fear going back to Asgard. Not the way one would fear an execution. He's certainly not looking forward to it. But I very much doubt they mean to kill him, or would tolerate us doing it for them. They haven't done a particularly good job of controlling him up till now. Do you really want to stake Earth's future on the bet that they'll do better in the future? Goddamn alien space Vikings, Fury muttered. As much as he hated to admit it, Xavier had a point. Fury didn't know enough about Asgard to be sure that he could count on their help. If Thor was anything like a representative of their culture, then it was entirely possible that the entire alien culture between them didn't have the right mindset to hold on to Loki for more than a few years at a time. And Xavier was right again. Loki was a problem without an expiration date. He'd keep coming back again and again until someone found a way to deal with him permanently. There was only one solution Fury knew that was that kind of permanent, and for all Fury knew Loki could find some way to circumvent aside. There's another thing to consider, Xavier was saying, bringing Fury out of his bitter thoughts. He folded his hands around that notebook of his. I couldn't help but notice, when I was taking a look about his mind, that I am not the only one to have done so recently. Fury stared. Are you suggesting he was being mind-controlled? He said. Thoughts of Agent Barton and that damnable scepter leapt startled into his mind. Oh, hell no, this was not a complication he needed now. Controlled? Xavier shook his head. No, I don't believe so. But there are definitely marks, scars in places where someone with powers not unlike my own was careless. There are parts of his memory that are sealed away under powerful barriers that are not of his own making. He smiled, a wintry little smile. I admit I would very much like to know what is behind those blocks. It could be something very valuable to us. Such as? Fury asked, intrigued. Such as the identity of whoever sent him here in the first place. What do you mean, sent him here? Fury demanded. Xavier's eyebrows rose nearly up to his non-existent hairline. What, surely you don't think he came here on his own, do you? Yes. Fury's mind was sent spinning, playing over his first encounter with Loki and all the subsequent fallout. At the beginning they had been working under the assumption that he was acting alone. And after that events had played out too fast for them to stop and readjust their assumptions at any point. Xavier gave him a look, and although he didn't say it out loud, Fury didn't need to be psychic to read well, that was dumb of you on his face. The army clearly was not his. That's plain enough in his memories even if it wasn't in the disparity of their technology and methods. Someone obviously furnished it for him. Someone who was all too pleased to send him along on the front lines and allow him to take the brunt of any counterattack. Most army commanders do not also take the role of advanced scout director. Fury groaned. His first reaction, unworthily, was well shit, didn't we have enough problems already? He would much rather deal with Loki and all his complications than to have to admit the existence of a bigger, badder enemy behind him who was still out there somewhere and mad as hell. Especially now that they no longer had the Tesseract to fuel their military defense research. But he was too much of a spy at heart to deny the existence of new intelligence just because it made him uncomfortable, so reluctantly, he faced the possibility head-on. So we need to get Loki to spill the beans on his former employer, he said. Xavier frowned. I'd like it to be that simple, he said. Unfortunately, whoever put the mental blocks on him was very thorough. He cannot say their name, or even think it to himself. Now that he's able to talk again, I'm sure we can find a way to get around that, Fury said. He strove to keep his voice cool and emotionless, but he also knew there was no point in not saying what was on his mind, since Xavier would pick it up in 2 seconds anyway. We have people who specialize in getting past protective conditioning. Nope, Charles gave him that look again, the one that looked calm but was unutterably angry. Apart from the fact that I have told you repeatedly I will not condone or assist with any efforts that involve torture, it wouldn't work, Nick. It's not that kind of block. He himself cannot break it from the inside, no matter how very much you make him want to. To attempt to force the issue would only crush his mind against that unyielding barrier. I wouldn't cry over that, Fury thought. Xavier folded his hands on the table and leaned back in the wheelchair, and there was that disappointed tutor look again. Director, I'm starting to find your bloodthirsty attitude in regards to your prisoner rather disturbing, he said in a neutral voice. Are you sure you have the necessary objectivity for this? In a word? No, it wasn't the most diplomatic he'd ever been, but there was no point in weaseling words around Xavier. And anyway, Fury was getting tired of trying to watch his tongue. Getting tired of Xavier's condescending, voice from on high attitude, and especially getting tired of his touchy-feely, hugs and kindness attitude towards their prisoner. Yes, Fury knew the regulations and would stick rigidly to them, because that was what separated men who kept order from men who served nothing but their own desires. He'd make sure Loki got 3 meals a day and a prisoner's coveralls and a bed to sleep on and proper medical care, should he need it. But he had no desire to forgive Loki and no desire whatsoever to rehabilitate him, and if the day came when Loki finally reaped the full measure of what he'd sown, then Fury would pull the trigger and be glad of it. Since it seems you haven't been paying attention, Professor, let me remind you. In the course of his little vacation on Earth he busted up one of my labs, terrorized a crowd in Germany, and oh yeah, flattened half of Manhattan during rush hour. Do you have any idea how many people died there? Civilians, innocents. Innocents, Xavier said, and his calm, almost cordial tone cut right through the heart of Fury's rant. Oh, let's talk about innocents. Suddenly, Fury wasn't at all sure that he wanted to. But Xavier had gotten the momentum of the conversation away from him, somehow, and ran with it. In the past year, the Sentinel Initiative hunted down and killed 127 adult mutants, Charles said, and the number sounded too precise to be anything but correct. In the past year, 5 cities have seen breakouts of anti-mutant riots, with 17 deaths, 5 of whom, I might add, were physically disabled humans and not mutants at all. Oh, and let's not forget the Rosemary Project. Started in 1997 as an anonymous data census on mutants. Then when the Bureau changed hands in 2005 turned to soliciting and then eventually kidnapping underage mutants, holding them against their will in a secured facility in Rosemary, Colorado. When the project was shut down in 2009, the cleanup crew decided against the advisability of letting loose a population of embittered and possibly dangerous mutants into the population, and 57 children and teens were given lethal injections. 3 escaped. I spoke with them at some length when they came to my school. I still do, every week, as part of their grief counseling. He'd started out the speech cold and clinical, but by the end of it his anger had clearly taken hold of him. He was angrier than Fury had ever seen him before, even in the dangerous and occasionally bloody occasions where they'd worked together on an operation before. It was hard to believe that he normally carried this rage so well hidden, so tightly suppressed. Allowed sometimes to heed his words or his gaze but never, ever allowed to take control. Not even now. None of this even addresses the MAD laws, now on the books in 46 states, I believe, including this one, which state that any suspect known to be a mutant should be considered as armed and hostile even if they have no weapon and show no hostile intent, and authorizes uses of deadly force by authorities under all circumstances up to and including a routine traffic stop. Xavier bites off the words with precise, furious diction. He might as well be spitting nails, each one landing with the force of a hammer blow. Current estimates run that these laws have led to the death of over 400 mutants, not counting non-mutant casualties in escalated situations where mutants defended themselves. So do not stand there wearing that badge, Director Fury, Do not stand there under the flag of the government that considers all these incidents lawful and authorized, and talk to me about innocence." Fury stood there with his hands clenched together behind his back and said nothing at all, swallowing against the angry denials or savage counter-arguments that rose to his teeth. Stood there and tried not to writhe too obviously in shame, because he had what Xavier was saying was true. S.H.I.E.L.D. had never been directly involved in anti-mutant initiatives. None of his projects ever had been. But nevertheless Fury's clearance was the highest, and so he was kept apprised. He was kept informed, in a detached and abstract way, of what measures and countermeasures were taken regarding the mutant threat. He was given monthly estimates of how angry the experts in the Pentagon estimated the mutant population to be on the heels of another riot, another purge. And what had Fury done? Nothing, not a damn thing. He'd seen this fight wasn't one he could win and turned away from it, deliberately channeled all his career into fighting battles that seemed cleaner. Simpler. Not always easy, not by a long shot, but fighting alien invasions over Manhattan was nothing so ugly as the brother against brother warfare of domestic security. He'd opted out of this battle long ago, and he'd done so without a pang of conscience, because mutants weren't his kind of people. All the same, Fury hadn't gotten where he was in life by letting other people push him around easily. "So what's your point?" he grated. "You're saying that because mutants have died, it's okay for this guy to kill other people? Like they cancel out somehow? It doesn't work that way." "No, that is not, in fact, my point." Xavier blew out his breath, squeezing his eyes shut and pressing his fingertips to his face. "My apologies, Director. I vented a great deal more of my feelings than I ought to have, given the circumstances. It won't happen again." "Do you know why I'm here, Director?" he asked. His voice was calmer, less passionate, but the anger was still there. "Not just here today, but in general. Why I choose to live as a peaceful part of human society rather than to tear it down. Why I haven't gone off to join Eric in his crusade to build a better world for our people. Why I lead my students in defense of your kind and not against them. Do you think it's easy for me to champion the cause of the humans, Director, when I hear my students speak of the abuses and tortures they endure at the hands of your kind?" Fury did wonder, sometimes. Not that he would ever insult Xavier by expressing his suspicion out loud, but he was security trained. Paranoia was built into him. There was an ongoing file on Charles Xavier, frequently updated, which everyone at his clearance and above had read. One of the subheaders was an ongoing circulating argument between three of the top head think tanks of the country, Fury included, about whether Charles Xavier could still be trusted, or whether they should activate the order to have him shot. Fury had always argued for trust. But sometimes, like now, he did wonder, not whether Xavier was worthy of trust, but whether they were. "Why?" Fury said, and his voice sounded amazingly calm, under the circumstances. "I do this because I believe that we can build nothing on foundations of hatred and violence," Xavier said. "I do this because I believe in giving humans not only a second chance, but a third, and a fourth, and however many chances it takes, because in the end, reconciliation is the only true option. All other paths lead to no end, only an endless cycle of vengeance and pain. I'm not a hero, Fury, and I'm certainly not an Avenger. I'm not out for justice. I'm out for peace. You and I both know about making the hard calls, and usually when people say they make the hard calls, they're talking about deciding who will die." Xavier leaned across the table towards him, his eyes bleak and his voice deadly serious. "But sometimes, the hard calls come in deciding who will live. Those who will walk free under the open sun that you'd rather see dead or buried. Those whose hand signed those papers and whose voice gave those orders. If the price for justice is too high, if claiming it will end in more chaos and retribution falling back on the heads of those under your care, then you must make your choice, knowing that the voices of the slain call out for justice which you cannot answer. Because they're dead, Director. You can't help them now, no matter how much blood you spend. You can only help those who are still living." He paused for a moment, and then added in a slightly sharper voice, "And if you mean to do that, then you need to get your head out of your ass where this prisoner is concerned." Fury took a deep breath, inhaling slowly through his nostrils and blowing it out in a forceful exhalation. When he forced himself to step back from his feelings, he could see that some of what Xavier said was undeniably true. Regardless of what Loki did or didn't deserve, what it came down to was that they weren't allowed to kill him and couldn't hold him forever. Fury wasn't at all certain that Xavier's optimistic plans of rehabilitation and reconciliation were options. There was too much hate and madness looking out of Loki's eyes for that. Fury didn't regret the actions they'd taken. He'd considered them necessary at the time and he still did now, but somehow he doubted the necessity of the actions would make Loki any more inclined to forgive them for the pain and indignities he'd suffered at their hands. Especially not because Fury wasn't sorry, couldn't be sorry, couldn't separate himself from his own grudges no matter how many fine words Xavier threw at him. So what should I do? Fury thought, helpless and frustrated. He couldn't say it out loud, because that would be surrendering too much of his autonomy as director of S.H.I.E.L.D., to ask an outsider for instructions like a small child. He couldn't say it, but he thought it. Xavier gave him a grave nod. "I'll take responsibility for interviewing Loki, if you'll authorize that," he said. "I believe I am the one most qualified to tackle those mental blocks he's carrying, and I'm sure the results will be of great interest to both of us." "Sure." The word left Fury's lips a little stiffly, but there it was all the same. "You'll have access to whatever you need, and authority over the prisoner equal to mine." It was a fairly major concession, but it was also a relief. Shifting part of the burden of his crazy immortal pain in the neck to someone else, someone surely more capable of handling it than himself. "I'll need to return to my base of operations for a short time," Xavier said, turning towards the door. "I have some research I'd like to do, and some resources to tap into. In the meantime, please make sure Loki gets a chance to rest. I'll be back later this evening and we can continue." "You're leaving?" Fury felt a stab of doubt. "What about that psychic hold thingy you've got around his magic? Because without that, we won't have any choice but to restrain him again." "That won't be necessary," Xavier assured him. "The restrictions I placed on him are temporary, but they'll hold without my presence for a few hours. After 20 hours or so they'll start to unravel, but I should return well before then." "Huh," Fury thought, and frowned. "Couldn't you make them last longer than that?" Xavier returned a bland smile, and Fury scowled. He could, Fury realized, but he wouldn't. Not if controlling Loki meant that Fury was required to keep letting Xavier back in. Xavier's smile turned to a chuckle. "I'm glad we came to an understanding," he said. He turned away from the conference table, tucking his notebook safely away, and started wheeling himself towards the corridor outside. "Professor!" Fury called out, just before Xavier passed through the door. He cleared his throat. "Those deaths, they would never have occurred on my watch." It was a forlorn scrap of assurance. He knew, a meaningless hypothetical boast of feats he'd never have a chance to claim. That if he'd been there, that if he'd been the one calling the shots, he would have done better. Xavier turned to meet his eyes, and nodded once in the direction of Loki's cell. "And his would never have occurred on mine." With that, he turned and left. Loki sprawled in the metal-framed chair, his hands bound by a length of metal chain that ran down to a bolt on the floor and back up again, and thought of elephants. The Spaemar, Charles Xavier, was here again. He returned time and time again no matter what measures Loki tried to ward him off. The first evening he'd come back, once Loki had eaten and drunk and had a little time to recover from the fits of delirium the horrid gag had brought on him. Loki had thought him a tool of Director Fury and determined to say nothing to him. He'd slouched in his chair, silent and sullen and glaring, and locked his teeth shut. He might have saved himself the effort. Xavier held up both ends of the conversation effortlessly, asking casual questions and then reaching into Loki's mind to pluck out the answers, as though Loki was an open book from which he might read aloud. Loki had flinched and snarled and scrambled to clear his mind, only to find with some horror that it was almost impossible to not think of things. If someone told you to think of pink elephant, for example, it was almost impossible not to think of one, no matter how hard you tried to push it from your mind. In the small hours of that night, however, he'd thought on a way to turn that very weakness to his advantage. The way not to think of something was to fill your mind with something else instead. And so when Xavier came to his cell the next day and began to talk at him, friendly and personable and oh so insufferably calm, Loki responded by calling into his mind the filthiest, most perverted sexual fantasy his mind could generate. If Xavier was going to insist on entering his mind like a voyeur, Loki thought, he could at least give him a show. He'd expected anger or at least shocked outrage, but instead Xavier reacted with no more than a raised eyebrow in Loki's direction. He redoubled his efforts, turning from thoughts of women he'd known and dreamt of in the past to more vile sexual acts. couplings with men, lewd perversions he'd never even had a chance to try in his long lifetime and only secretly imagined to himself in the dark hours. Xavier took it all in stride without a break to his equanimity, as though he were twice Loki's age and had seen so much in his life that nothing left could surprise him, although he did spare a snort and a dry comment on one or two of Loki's most fabulously unlikely flights of fancy. "I do work with teenagers, just so you know," Xavier advised him pleasantly. Once it became clear that sexual thoughts were not going to drive Xavier away, although they did at least succeed in the goal of stopping any further questions, Loki turned in desperation to darker thoughts of cruelty and violence. He called to mind memories of past battlefields, screaming horrors that had flashed by him and that he had blocked away for the sake of his sanity. He confidently expected this to work. All the mortals, with very definite exceptions, such as Fury or the Red Widow woman, were soft, tender-hearted, and Loki suspected that Xavier was even softer and more foolish than most. He must be, surely, he must be outright addled in the head if his moronic, wrong-headed compassion extended to even such a creature as Loki. When memories of his brother's battlefields began to run thin, he filled in the gaps with his own dark dreams of power. Dreams of crushing Midgard, breaking Asgard, forcing his family and all these foolish humans to bow before him. Fantasies of revenge on Fury, on all those who dared to hold him captive and take such liberties with his person. He drew over the details of his revenge with great vicious care, imagining the look of fear and awe on his face as the life bled from his body. Ugly flashing thoughts of overpowering Xavier himself, if only he were freed of these bindings, of dragging the broken man from his ridiculous metal chair and smashing him to the ground. Surely that would be enough to horrify and repulse Xavier, letting such evil fill his mind. But in the end, Xavier still sat before him unmoved, his expression calmly composed and his gaze unwavering. If that was a lie to conceal his true feelings, Loki had to admit, he was in the presence of the master. "Are you quite done?" Xavier asked him. Yes, Loki thought. He refused to say it out loud, but he could not deny it in his own mind. Hours of furious concentration on such vile images left him feeling drained and exhausted, and much more shaken and sickened than he had expected. Clearly, this was not going to work. "Good," Xavier said. "There's really no need for this, Loki. I'm not trying to interrogate you. I only want to talk. You can ask me questions too, if you'd like. I'm sure there are things you'd like to know too, and I'd be happy to tell you." What an obvious, transparent lie that was. "I cannot imagine what petty doings of this mortal sphere would hold the slightest interest for me," Loki said. But a spark of interest had caught within him despite himself. Banal doings of worthless mortals they might be, but at least it would be something to occupy his mind. Loki still had hopes, in some silent, buried part of his mind, to be brought out and looked at only when he was alone. That he could find some way to bend Xavier and his powers to his own will, to enlist his aid in escaping this place and planning his next campaign. But if he could not persuade him, then in order to escape from here Loki knew he would have to find a way to defeat him, and to do that he needed to know more. As much as he wished the Spaemar would leave and take his terrifying, too discerning magic with him, a part of Loki longed for conversation, for stimulation. It was not only thirst and hunger alone that had driven him into that terrible trance, nor even the unyielding muzzle that cut into his lips and gums until the only taste he knew was that of his own blood. As much as any of those things, it was sheer boredom that had driven him to the point of hallucinations, the mind-numbing tedium of blank walls and barren cells with nowhere to go, nothing to do, and no one to speak to. The endless empty hours had fallen down on him like drips of water on his forehead, silently wearing away at his sanity around the edges. Loki's mind had always been quick, easily prone to restless boredom at the best of times. Now, his unresting, unrelieved thoughts beat against the blank walls around him until they threatened to drag him into raving madness. The hunger and thirst and pain were cured now, but the boredom remained. None of the shield guards would respond to him at all save Fury, and Loki had absolutely no desire to talk to him. What good was it for his tongue to be loosed if he could not draw on his magic to escape? What good was it to be able to speak, to cajole and threaten and persuade his captors, if none of them would listen? But now he had a challenge, something that offered a respite from the endless grinding tedium of silence and enforced inactivity. Xavier was not like these other mortals, their minds weak and dull and their souls flat and magicless. Xavier was infuriating, Xavier was maddening, Xavier was intriguing, full of contradictions. Human, and yet not. Passive and yielding in his manner, yet possessing a determination that could, demonstrably, outlast Loki's own stubbornness. Weak and crippled in body, yet unbelievably strong in mind. Loki knew the danger of trusting to appearances. He would not make the mistake of underestimating Charles Xavier more than once. To be in his presence was every moment a risk, but without the risk there could be no reward. Were he free of his bonds, Loki had little doubt that he could take the little human out. Though not as strong as his kindred, Loki had the strength of the gods, monster, and long, long years of training. That he could crush Xavier in a physical fight was not even a contention. That he could beat him in a duel of spells or magic, well, assuming he was free to use his magic at all, Loki had no doubt that he would prevail. But Loki was not free, he was chained to the spot and helpless to defend himself against that humans might do. Xavier was powerful, dangerous. He was a Speimar, like Heimdall, one of the Seeing Ones, and Heimdall was the only lord in Asgard, save Odin Allfather himself, that Loki ever truly feared. Loki had to wonder if even Odin could match against Xavier in the arena of the mind, although it would certainly be an interesting battle to watch. Loki knew of no other being in all the realms whose power approached him, except perhaps, Loki wasn't sure. For a fleeting moment he thought he knew, but then again it was gone. Such powers were terrifying. Loki knew. Such powers could rip and tear and crush a defenseless mind, could twist thoughts back on themselves until he knew not what was real and what was, could hurt him, more than anything else in the universe ever had. Charles Xavier could do that to him. There was nothing that Loki could do to stop him, and certainly no other would intercede on his behalf. Fury would probably watch through his lifeless spy windows and laugh all the while. Charles Xavier could destroy him, reduce him to nothing but a shell. And Loki did not understand why he did not. He couldn't stand this, having no defense, no recourse against the inevitable. If he could not flee, and he could not fight, then his only option was to try to charm his way out. Loki could be charming, he knew, when he put his mind to it. Could be personable and witty and sympathetic and debonair. Could project such an aura of wry friendly innocence that even those who knew him best, should have known better, still fell for it time after time. Dazzled by the surface, never once seeing through to the monster inside. So Loki smiled, sweet and playful and just a little bit sheepish. The okay, you got me. Good one smile he'd used to get himself out of far too many escapades in Asgard in ages past. But I do owe you a favor, it's true, he conceded. You helped me with that most unpleasant business with the gag. Xavier's gaze on him was cool and thoughtful, and Loki turned up a few watts on the smile. He could do this, he could do this. It would be harder to fool a Speimar, but if Loki could not hide all of his thoughts behind obfuscating images, he could at least deflect them sometimes. So when his thoughts strayed to things he did not want Xavier to hear, he did not try to force them away, but instead filled his head with thoughts of elephants. How on earth had such a creature ever come into being? Whoever had come up with their concept, Loki decided, had a truly strange sense of humor. So, Loki, Xavier said thoughtfully, and settled himself back with his hands laced together over his lap. There was a glass of water at his elbow. And another one at Loki's, and he tried not to feel too grateful for it when he knew Xavier could hear. Which seemed to indicate they would be here for a while. Tell me about your mother. Mother, Frigga, golden honey blonde hair rippling from a long braid as she leaned down over him, her face in shadow but outlined in a halo of light. Soft hands in cool skirts and a soothing, murmuring voice and, I'm afraid I can't help you there, Loki said, in a tone of deliberately affected innocence. I never knew my mother. Some frost giant slatterned back on Jotunheim, I suppose. Xavier smiled. Tell me about the woman who raised you, then, he said. Loki eyed him warily. Why do you want to know? He asked. What use could such knowledge possibly be to a mortal? Did they hope to plan some tactics, some strategic assault on Asgard? Should he stop them? Or encourage them? But, not Frigga, no, there was no purpose to such a thing. It would tear out the heart of Asgard, leave Odin hollow. Thor wept in grieving. They would be weak then, unprepared for an assault. No, Loki fixed his thoughts firmly on the strangeness of elephants. their wickedly curving tusks, the gray wrinkled skin and long sinuous appendages, elephants. I find it's a good place to start when getting to know someone, Xavier answered, at the beginning. Not an assault on Asgard, then, only on Loki himself. You wish to know my weaknesses, he challenged. And your strengths, Xavier said, and everything in between. All that afternoon Xavier continued to ask him about Asgard, confusing and irrelevant trivialities that could bear no strategic value, even if this batch of mortals could ever be fool enough to think they could oppose Asgard and somehow win. Instead, the shriveled little mortal rambled on about pointless topics of childhoods and memories, books and hobbies and favorite foods. It would not match his new strategy of pleasing cooperation if he wasted his energy deflecting such trivial sorties, so Loki allowed himself to be drawn into the topic despite himself. It was all meaningless, anyway, all lies. He had never belonged in Asgard, had never been a prince, never been Aesir at all. Nothing more than a Jotun cuckoo in fair fledgling, part of a grotesque pantomime carried out by his mother and father as everyone in the household played along that he was a real child. It had all been no more than a lie, and so it meant nothing to him. Xavier spoke reminiscently of the house where he'd grown up, a rambling and gently aging mansion somewhere in the hills of New England. Whatever had happened to the old England? Loki wondered. How when summer ended chill the would turn the leaves from green to gold and red and yellow. A profusion of treasure shimmering along the hillsides in the autumn wind. Loki hadn't been prepared for the answering surge of memories that swirled up within him in response, nor to the half-anguish, half-regret that accompanied them. Memories of walking in his mother's garden, the grass prickling and itchy under his skin. Frigga's private garden. It had been the cloistered retreat of the royal family when the princes were young. It had long since been remodeled, turned into another practice yard for the palace guard. The grass dug up and replaced with hard flagstones, and the trees pruned back to shadows of their former selves, centuries gone. But in his mind it was still as it had been, the bright stones of the path and the jewel-colored leaves hanging before him almost close enough to touch. Thor had run ahead, shouting and laughing, and climbed in the trees. Loki had been too small to reach the lower branches, and he'd sulked at the injustice of it all until Frigga laughed and hugged him, pulled him into her lap and gave him cherries from her own plate. Loki couldn't remember any more whether they'd been his favorite food before then, or had become his favorite after that day, but for years the cherry tarts that the kitchens baked on Donnerstag afternoons had been the prime target of his and Thor's snitching expeditions. The memories leapt with agonizing clarity into Loki's mind, the star-spangled sky and the golden buildings and the time-frozen, picture-perfect people there. And Loki hated that he could not banish them from his mind as passionately as he hated Xavier for reminding him, as passionately as he hated Fury for binding him here. It perhaps shouldn't have been a surprise that after that particular conversation, when the Speymar had vanished for the evening meal and his little guard puppets brought him food in a flimsy plastic tray, to find the evening meal accompanied by an offering of cherries. Foolishness. He knew what Xavier was trying to accomplish, just as he also knew that it wouldn't work. He was Loki Leesmith, Loki Ravengod, Loki Trickskin. He had hundreds of years old and a mountain of corpses under his feet. He did as he pleased. He was not to be tamed by choice morsels of food, not to be brought to heel and made to obey by simple, pitiful acts of kindness. How do you know? The treacherous doubts in his head whispered. Has anyone ever tried? If Xavier thought this would work on him, he was more of a fool than Loki ever imagined him to be. He ate the cherries anyway, just to show them that he did what he pleased. How old are you, Loki? Loki cocked his head and frowned. It was a strange question. Hink of a way they could use that information against him. Why do you want to know? He said suspiciously. Xavier smiled. Perhaps I'm just curious, he said. I'm a teacher, after all. It's a habit of my vocation to always want to place people in the right age group. Loki gave a dry laugh. Rest assured I am far older than any of your students, he said. In all likelihood, I am older than all of your students combined. He didn't know the exact number in Midgard years. Offhand, conversions between Midgard and Asgard time could be tricky. He'd worked it out once, years ago when he'd been bored, but those calculations were far out of date by now. It had never been something he'd thought to need to know. Never had he imagined being stranded here, amongst mortals. I was more thinking developmental age than chronological age, Charles said mildly. To the best of our knowledge, Acer have all the same stages of life as humans: childhood, adulthood, old age. Whereabouts are you in that progression? How should I compare? Loki said irritably. You mortals drop dead at 40 years, do you not? Hardly enough time to measure. Xavier stifled laughter. That's a bit out of date, he said. There might have been a time when that was true, but with modern nutrition and medicine things aren't nearly so dire. In the United States, at least, the average lifespan is around 80 years. That's hardly any longer, Loki snorted. What was Xavier getting at with this? Loki scowled at him, mind racing from one possible angle to the next. Unless Xavier thought to belittle him by implying he was still a callow youth incapable of defending himself? We have a few different ways to measure adulthood, Xavier said casually. At 16 years old, you are allowed to drive your own vehicles. That's generally considered an important milestone. At 18 you are eligible to join the army. And at 21, you can legally drink alcohol. Though most people don't actually wait that long. That startled a laugh out of Loki, short-circuiting the building resentment. So at this mark of 18 years your people can go off to war, but cannot yet drink in the company of men? Truly, Midgardians have strange priorities, he mused. Xavier chuckled in rueful agreement. 21 serves as the marker for a few other things, as well. At 18 you can vote, but you can't hold political office until 21. I suppose it's only fair, since it would be cruel to ask anyone to sit through endless senatorial hearings without a promise of a stiff drink at the end. Loki's smile faded slightly as contemplation of Midgard's strange customs led inevitably to a comparison with home Asgard. Not home, how easily his treacherous thoughts betrayed that word. There were some similarities, he supposed. On Asgard a boy became a man when he had achieved his first great feat of strength, not at any arbitrary predetermined date. But long tradition held that no Acer could serve on the Althing, nor rule as a lord, until he had completed his second century of life. It had been that 200th birthday that Thor had recently passed, and the coronation had been set to mark the occasion, since Odin could not have passed the crown to him before then. Loki, of course, still had decades to go before he reached that all-important mark. Technically, he'd been too young yet to take the throne. Yet another way that his own brief, disastrous kingship had broken all bounds of propriety and outraged the sensibilities of Asgard. If there had been anyone else who could have taken the throne during that interregnum, anyone at all, Loki knew they would have passed him over, again. Not that Odin would have ever allowed a Jotun to sit upon Helicarrier, no matter how many centuries had passed him by. Loki swallowed black gall, and forced his attention back to the matter at hand, gratefully seizing on any excuse to escape his own thoughts. I suppose by your standards, then, I would be perhaps 19 or 20 of your own years. The words fell casually from his lips, but the silence that followed them was so sudden that a coin dropping would have been loud as a thunderbolt. Seized with a sudden uneasy suspicion, Loki glanced around at the faces of his captors, trying to pin down the sudden change of attitude. Why? What does it matter? He demanded, bristling defensively. Nothing you need to worry about, Loki, Xavier said, and although his expression was free of any overt humor, Loki was absolutely convinced that somehow, the little mortal was laughing at him. Let's talk about Thor, Xavier suggested later that afternoon. And Loki had known that this question was coming, because it was always about Thor in the end. Everyone wanted to know about Thor, to talk about Thor, to be with Thor and pay attention to Thor. He, Loki, was only ever an afterthought, a stepping stone to the son of Odin who was real, only ever considered as an annex to his arrogant, stupid, golden, thick-headed, muscle-brained, perfect fool of a brother. No one looked at Loki and saw Loki, no one, not even this Speimar whose sight was so keen, whose wits were so dangerous, who fought battles of the mind with powers of magic like him. Loki had thought maybe, Loki had hoped maybe, but no, never, never. Xavier hadn't even met Thor yet and already he liked him better. He didn't care about Loki. Why would anyone care about Loki when they could care about Thor instead? Why? Let's not, Loki forced out through clenched teeth, careful to enunciate his words through the storming howl of pain, rage, love, hate, guilt, envy, shame in his mind. It mattered not what he said. He would be ignored. He was always ignored. Hold your tongue. Know your place. No one cared what he thought or felt. No one. All right, Xavier said, quietly, and he didn't ask about Thor again. Earlier, you said something about the conversions between Midgard and Asgard time being difficult, Xavier said. Can you tell me more about that? Loki frowned, rewinding the last hour's worth of conversation. I am quite certain that I said nothing of the sort, he said. Xavier smiled. Thought it very loudly, then, he said. But please, I'm curious. What do you mean? Once again Loki was astounded by how little these humans understood about the universe and their own place in it. I was a geneticist before I became a teacher, Xavier reminded him. If you want to talk comparative astrophysics, look up Jane Foster. Loki rolled his eyes, leaned back in the hard metal chair and spread his hands as far apart as the chains would allow. Time does not flow at the same speed across all the realms, he said. It is slightly different on each of the realms, but the difference of Midgard to the others is the greatest. It is why your realm is commonly known as the abode of mortals, although many of the other races of the Nine do not live forever. But the much greater rate of years here on Midgard means that you humans seem to age and die so much the faster. How much faster? Xavier wanted to know. It is not exact. Loki felt obligated to warn him. The sages tend to say that a mortal's life to that of an Aesir is that of 9 times 9. 9 times as many years in our lives, which pass 9 times faster on Midgard. But that is really just a literary convention. On average, it's closer like 7.5. Xavier looked taken aback. So you're saying that for every year on Asgard, almost 10 years pass here on Earth? He asked. More or less, Loki said. It is why Odin always forbade us, as children, against getting too attached to any mortals. They would only die and leave his heart broken. Strange to think that he should reverse his ruling, and actually encourage Thor to befriend humans during his banishment here. His mouth twisted bleakly, as comparisons rose up unbidden. But then, the rules somehow managed never to apply to Thor. Xavier was quiet for a moment, then prompted him, you said that it was an average. Why an average? It is not constant, Loki said, relieved to be broken out of his bitterness to talk about more abstract matters. Sometimes the difference is greater, sometimes it is less. It goes in cycles within cycles, periods of time when our two realms are brought closer together and the time becomes more synchronized. When the timeframes of two realms coincide, there tends to be war. A small smile played about his lips as he remembered his history. The last great synchronization had occurred 150 years ago, Asgard time, or over a millennium in Midgard time. The Jotnar had taken advantage of the nearly synchronous timeframes to launch an assault on Midgard, and Asgard had found itself, quite unusually, able to respond in a timely manner. The war between gods and monsters that had raged back and forth over primitive Midgard had been enough to nearly split the fragile world apart. Loki had, of course, been just a baby then. The rest of the time, when the streams move further apart, they tend to just ignore you for the most part, Loki said. You should be just as grateful, really. And what is it now? Charles asked with interest. Moving closer together, or further apart? Should we expect war or indifference? Indifference. Loki grimaced, trying not to feel the aching twinge in his chest at the thought of how he'd been abandoned here. The gulf between the two realms was at their widest, now. Loki knew it. He'd been counting on it, counting on Asgard being too slow to mount a response to his doings here. He'd expected to have days, maybe weeks to mount his campaign and assert his control over Earth before Odin could send anyone to stop him. Instead, Thor had landed on the roof of his plane after barely a single day. He must have departed Asgard within the hour of Loki being spotted on Earth. And how had he convinced Odin to commit so much power so fast? Loki could only wish that it was anything to do with himself, not the Tesseract or the safety of these gods-bedamned mortal pets, that had fueled his urgency. What was keeping Thor now, Loki could only imagine. He'd been stuck stewing here in his own juices for 3 Midgardian weeks now, with nary a sound from his brother. No doubt, Loki thought bitterly, Thor would be quick enough to put in an appearance if he were somehow to escape from his bonds and rampage among the humans again, if he were to try to execute any of his so carefully laid plans. Elephants. Now was not the time to think of plans. Think instead of elephants. No doubt Thor and Odin found it convenient to simply forget about him, out of sight, out of mind. No doubt there were many important affairs of Asgard to occupy Odin's mind. No doubt Thor found more satisfaction in roistering with his sycophants than to spare a thought for Loki. If he were to be dragged home in chains, it would be such an embarrassment to Odin. A scandal to all of Asgard. No doubt it was easier to let him rot here, behind the sterile metal walls and stifling magical wards the mortals had built to contain him, to wither away under the flood of Midgardian years while they basked in the golden youth and glory of Asgard without him. No doubt. The mortal looked at him sorrowfully, but thankfully said nothing, no insipid words to try to convince him otherwise, and that, Loki thought, was as good as a confirmation. Here, Xavier said, the next time he came to the cell, read this. Loki accepted the sheet of paper the Spaemar handed across to him with wary gingerness, as though it were coated with poison or bespelled to burst into flame at his touch. It did neither, and Loki's eyes automatically began to scan down the printed lines, then did a double take when he recognized it. This is my letter? He thought, gaze rising to meet Xavier's with surprise. The one he'd written weeks ago, back when his increasing need had finally broken down his pride enough to deign to communicate with his captors. It had been all for naught, of course. These savages were ignorant of even the Midgardian languages Loki had learned years ago, and Loki did not know their modern script. Not that Fury and his scurrying minions would have been likely to give him anything useful, anyway, but just the act of communicating with another living being would have made so much of a difference. Yes, it is. Xavier pulled out a notebook of his own, uncapped a pen and poised his fingers over a blank page. Please, read it. Aloud. Loki's eyebrows raised, and he had to exert effort not to flush with anticipated humiliation. At the time of writing it, he'd been extremely frustrated, and some of the words that had been transcribed onto the page did not bear repeating. Not that he didn't stand by his own words, of course. But his captors would not likely be pleased by some of the descriptions he'd awarded them in his rant. Xavier's own eyebrow went up in response. To yourself, if you would prefer, he said, gesturing with his pen. Somewhat suspiciously, Loki complied. As he scanned down the page, Xavier's pen went flying over his own. At the end of it, Xavier set the stylus aside and ripped the page out of his book, handing it across the table. Here. You'll want this. What is it? Loki accepted the page, even more warily than before. He could not for the life of him see what this was supposed to accomplish, and the not knowing made him tense and defensive. An English translation of your own letter, Xavier explained. From the paper to your thoughts to mine back to paper. It won't be exact, but with the two pieces of text for comparison, you should be able to get a start on learning the language. Loki blinked, stunned with the implications of the scraps of parchment in his hand. Meanwhile, the scholar's part of his brain went into overdrive at the thought of what a boon this could provide to the archive section of Asgard's library. Instant translation of ancient ULD only work if a native speaker of that language were at hand. He cleared his throat. He wanted to say thank you, but if he admitted his gratitude, then what service or servitude might the Spaemar demand in return? No favors were ever granted for free, not for Loki. He stiffened, and retreated into his chair as much as the chains still on his hands would allow. What makes you think I have any interest in learning your primitive tongue? He managed to say at last. Xavier shrugged, as if it mattered not to him. You don't have to, if you don't wish to, he said. But you can keep the translation anyway. For the novelty of it. Loki gave Xavier a suspicious glower, but his hands crept out and curled around the papers all the same. You held the throne of Asgard for a time, didn't you? While Thor was banished? Loki glanced uneasily at Xavier and then away, as though he could hide his thoughts if only he avoided eye contact. The little mortal looked so small and harmless sitting there, housed in that metal conveyance that compensated for his frailty. That was an illusion, though. The truth could be seen if you only looked at his eyes. Power in those eyes, dangerous, deadly. Yes, Loki said. There was no reason to hide it, he had nothing to hide. He was the rightful king. Rightful. Odin slept. The succession fell to me. Why not me? Odin said I was born to be king. But no one wanted me, they only wanted Thor. To push me out of the way so that Thor could stand in glory once more. But he was banished. Odin banished him. Only a king could lift that sentence, and why should I? What did I owe it to him? To any of them? To let Thor come back and push me aside so that he could finish leading the realm into ruin? And so you became king, Xavier mused. Did it make you happy? No, it hadn't. Loki kept his mouth shut, lips pressed thin together, but the truth of it screamed across his mind. No, from the moment his hand had closed on Gingnir's haft to the moment he opened his fingers and let go, he had not known a moment's peace. He who sat on Helicarrier ruled over not only Asgard, but by extension held guardianship over all the 9 realms. Asgard's king had no equal, no check upon his power. He had absolute power, indisputable authority. So it had been for thousands of years, yet it had taken Loki only 2 days to realize that absolute power existed only on sufferance of those who carried out the orders. There had been no one upon whom he could rely, in whom he could confide. Only his mother, and she one of those who had betrayed him. His kingship was a sham, a hollow mockery. His father's advisors had treated him with barely veiled contempt. His brother's friends with open hostility. No sooner had commands left his lips than they had run to disobey them. Even Heimdall, the great golden guardian whose loyalty was supposed to be beyond question, had not hesitated to betray him. When he returned to Asgard, he would be revenged on them for such slights. He would finish what the destroyer had barely begun, rend them limb from limb and burn them to ashes. Elephants, elephants, he thought frantically, trying to rein his murderous emotions back before Xavier sensed them. He'd sought to find a way to turn the people's favor towards them, to find a way to win their obedience if not their respect. It was not an uncommon occurrence in the history of Asgard that a new, untried king would break in his reign with a bloody war or two, to prove his strength and win the acclaim of his warrior people. With Thor's idiocy having brought war with Jotunheim to their doorstep, it was too good a possibility for him to pass up. With the Allfather laid low and Asgard's mightiest warrior cast out, it was a surety that Jotunheim would try to take advantage. It was a threat to the safety of the realm that could not be ignored. Yet Loki knew that he did not dare to lead Asgard's army against Jotunheim. He feared to turn his back to them, shied away from issuing orders that he knew would not be obeyed. Even if he could compel them to follow him, why should he have to compel, persuade, enforce loyalty? Why should it not be given him unasked, as it was always given Thor? Why was Thor worthy of loyalty, respect, admiration, love, and he was not? He would be expected to lead the charge. It was inevitable that in such a melee, he would once again be touched, and exposed for the truth of what he was. Even if he avoided open war with the Jotun, was only a matter of time until he was found out. Already Thor's friends looked at him with such suspicion, such distrust. They had been with him in Jotunheim. One of them might have seen the frost giant grab his arm and how he yet remained unhurt. They would turn on him. They would kill him the instant they realized, Jotun imposter, cuckoo, traitor, monster. No one would speak for him, no one would defend him. Thor was gone and Odin slept. There was no protection on which he could call. The truth of being king, Loki realized, was that a king had no friends and no father. He was absolutely alone. Seated in the great golden throne, with the staff of absolute power in his hand, Loki had felt nothing more beside a hunted beast, fleeing from one cover to the next while the baying of hounds sounded all around him. "It doesn't sound like it was a terribly fulfilling experience for you," Xavier said dryly, and Loki glared at him. He might be defeated, bound and stripped of his freedom and his power, but he would not be made a mock of by this crippled little mortal. He, Loki Mischief Prince, was the one who inflicted such needling on the warriors of Asgard, puncturing their self-important egos with teasing barbs. The parallel was obvious and not one he wished to think on too deeply. "So why did you do it?" Xavier prompted him. "Why what?" Loki snapped, mind still on Asgard, still caught in the vivid throes of those humiliating memories. Why had he become king? What choice had he? He'd never wanted the throne, but he'd needed the chance to prove himself. He knew the moment the servant had held out the spear towards him that such an opportunity would never come again, whether by chance or manipulation. Why had he sent the destroyer? What else was he to have done, surrounded by traitors and oath-breakers who sought to ruin everything? "Why did you want to be king on Midgard?" Xavier asked, and his voice was strangely soft, strangely gentle. Almost compassionate, as though he were discussing some abstract, tragic drama and not the attempted conquest of his own home. "Because Loki stopped abruptly, the words cutting off as though by a falling blade. "Because." The second attempt went no better than the first. The words, he'd lost the words. They slithered and vanished out of his sight for all he tried to clutch at them. When he tried to pursue them, it was though he'd run headfirst into a stone wall, leaving him stunned and stupid with the impact. He stared across at Xavier, helplessly mute. As much as you were despised and distrusted on Asgard, you had to know it would be 10 times worse on a conquered realm. Xavier continued relentlessly. You had to know that the humans would not submit to you tamely, or else you would not have made such a show of force on your first arrival. Earth would never surrender to you, Loki, never. You had to realize that on some level. Why, then? There is no throne, the mouthy little craftsman had told him. He'd known it, even then he'd known it to be true, but by then it was too late. Why, indeed? Still he was speechless, bereft of words and answers, and now Loki was beginning to panic. Questions, they had questions for him and he could not answer, they would surely hurt him now, bring pain until they squeezed the answers from him in between his screams. But he could not answer, it wasn't that he refused, he could not, and there would be no respite for him, no escape, no way out. I know, Loki stuttered, his tongue feeling numb, his words slush-mouthed. Duh. He had to say something, all. The panic mounted, both from fear of what the humans might do to him if he did not and the unexpected terror of finding such a trap within his own mind. He forced his voice to work, pushed out the first and only words that would come to him. You will kneel because you must, you are lesser, you are nothing, you are made to be ruled, to be bound, to bow and to scream in lightless squalor where all is lost in emptiness, to serve. He hardly even knew what he was saying, where these tumbled rush of words came from, but once he started he could not stop. They came boiling out of him from some fathomless place marked round with jagged crimson edges. You exist only to die, to give up your worthless lives in flyspeck glory at my coming, the wake of my passing crimson with the blood of allies and enemies alike. Bones paving the path to the citadel under the howling sky where she. Do you hear yourself, Loki? Xavier cut across the rush of words, his voice low and clear, not heard through his voice, clogged with rushing white noise, but in his mind. These are not your words, Loki. This is not you. Who speaks through you now? Who uses you as his avatar? He could feel it now. After that first day, when the Spamar's magic had lain heavy as a suffocating blanket across his sea, trapping him here, exposed as a butterfly in a pin. He had barely noticed Xavier's touch on his mind at all. Merely a tickle, a light brush against his thoughts that reminded him constantly to be wary. Now he could feel the mortal's power inside his head, pressing and pulling at something that ached. His jaw felt stiff, his tongue numb and leaden. What are you doing? To me? He choked out, each word felt as though cut with his teeth from a wooden plank. I'm trying to help you, Loki, work with me, let me help you. That was a lie. That was a filthy lie and Loki knew it, he should know, he was the expert on lies. No one tried to help him, no one ever had, and no one would now that he was disgraced, outcast, defeated, criminal, despised, failed. A scream burst from his throat, strangled and animal. No words, he had no words, they had all been sealed away inside him, leaving him mute and silent and powerless to defend himself. What had he ever had to battle with, to bargain with, but his mind and his words? Without them, what would be left of him? Just a mute, hollow shell, to be stuffed and dressed up and paraded before a cruel audience in a dumb show. He would not submit to that, he would not. Loki threw himself into mindless struggle. Forgetting the cautious reserve told him it was no good, it was useless. There were too many enemies out there and they were too strong. His hands were chained, pinned to the floor. Pinned, like a hunted animal on a spear. He could neither reach nor escape his tormentors, he couldn't get out, he couldn't speak and couldn't fight and couldn't flee and the pressure in his head grew to be too much, feeling like it would split him behind his eyes. Loki threw himself forward, slamming his forehead against the unyielding metal of the table in a desperate attempt to relieve it. There was a screeching noise as the metal bent and warped, lost in the static that spread across his skull in a strange white silence. Somewhere very distantly he could hear shouting, but that meant nothing to him. At least the cacophony inside his head was silenced. I'm sorry, he heard Xavier saying, as if from a great distance. I pushed too hard, too soon. We'll try again another time, when you're ready. Now, the mortal's voice whispered in his mind, clear as if spoken directly in his ear. The command was heavy with calm, silence, a promise of freedom from fear and relief from pain. Sleep. Loki slept. The demigod, or frost giant, whatever the hell he was, dropped so quickly it was almost insulting. One moment he'd been pitching some kind of fit, throwing his weight against the chains like he'd been possessed. Even the titanium adamantium alloy, Fury's pride and joy when it came to state-of-the-art technical developments, started to bend and twist under the strain. Fury barely had time to hit the big red panic button on his console and was halfway through a tersely worded alarm that would send a dozen extra guards into the cell, for all the good they'd be able to do, anyway. The most he could hope for was to slow their prisoner down while Fury used his emergency channels to call some of his more high-powered allies into the fray, and then Xavier hadn't even moved throughout their prisoner's explosion of fury. One moment Loki had been jerking around like a mad beast, and the next his eyes rolled back in his head and he slumped bonelessly over the table, his breathing evening out into the rhythms of deep sleep. The telepath hadn't even needed to touch him. No wonder Xavier hadn't been particularly worried about Fury stationing guards in the cell or out in the hallway. Fury was somewhere between impressed and mildly outraged at how easy it had been. Couldn't Xavier have seen fit to be on hand the first time their would-be mad dictator had tried to take over the Earth? However it had happened, Loki was unconscious now, and at Xavier's request Fury had his men carefully unhook him from the chair and take him back to his even more heavily reinforced sleeping cell. It was clear there'd be no more interviews today, and Fury stood beside Xavier in the corridor and watched as his men carried Loki past them on a stretcher. New bruises bloomed on that pale skin, on his wrists where the manacles had bitten him, on his forehead where he'd slammed it into the table hard enough to crumple the reinforced steel. Fury eyed them with a deep doubt. He knew better than most how hard Loki was to damage, how hard it was to put even such marks as those on him. How desperate must Loki have been, to struggle so hard and so fruitlessly. They hadn't, as far as Fury could tell, been talking about anything that should have been so painful or difficult a topic. What could possibly have set him off so violently? "Are you starting to believe me now?" Xavier remarked from his elbow. "That someone has been tampering with his mind, and left ligatures on his memories that he cannot break." Instead of answering him, Fury deliberately turned his back to Xavier in order to watch the retreating progress of their prisoner down the corridor and away. He was starting to, a little bit. But lifelong habits of suspicion could not be so easily erased. He could be faking it, he said distantly, not because he hoped to persuade Xavier to change his mind or even because he fully believed it himself, but because he knew Xavier would sense his doubts whether he spoke them aloud or not. It still made him feel better, to imagine that he had some control over what Xavier heard from him. "He is not," Xavier assured him. "I have only your word that what you say is going on with him is the truth," Fury said, keeping his voice careful and controlled. It was a logical objection to make, he thought, a perfectly reasonable doubt. Somewhat to his relief, Xavier chuckled, apparently not offended by his suspicions. "That's true," he said. "And I'm afraid there aren't any other proofs I could offer. At least, none that you could accept. But you decided to trust me when you first brought me here, Director. It hardly makes sense for you to change your mind now." Fury nodded wordlessly, acknowledging the truth of Xavier's words even if he couldn't fully accept them, couldn't put the careful doubts fully from his mind. "If it helps," Xavier offered him in a bright tone, sounding detached and clinical and almost amused by the whole situation. "Think of it this way. If for some reason I wanted you to trust me, Director Fury, you would." And with that, reassuring thought, Xavier left him standing there in the corridor, staring after the unconscious form of the stricken god. Despite his lingering doubts, the scene in Loki's cell the previous day did cause Fury to unbend a little bit. Perhaps he was starting to wonder, against his will, whether Loki's guilt was as unassailable as they had first assumed, but more likely because Charles had so definitively demonstrated his ability to keep Loki under control if the alien made a break for it. Either way, Fury at last consented to unchain Loki's hands during their interviews. He felt Loki's sheer delight as the heavy manacles were removed, rubbing at his wrists with his hands and testing his new range of motion. But when Loki raised his gaze to meet Charles's, his expression smoothed back into blank wariness. Loki did not clearly remember the incident of the night before. His memories of the period just before unconsciousness were a vague blur, but it was clear that on some level he remembered Charles hurting him. Charles could still see the mental blocks in his mind, or at least, he could see where they were not, unnatural patches of blankness bound to his psyche like white stitching against white leather. Charles had, in the course of his work with mutants and non-mutants alike, occasionally been compelled to put mental blocks over certain abilities or memories, but never anything quite like this. It revolted him, in a way that would be almost impossible to explain to a non-telepath, to see those incisions and stitches upon a living mind. Loki was prevented from thinking clearly about anything connected with a certain subject, with an inexorable, almost surgical precision. There was a chill, remote quality about the work that disturbed Charles deeply. Whoever had done this to him had been no amateur in manipulations of the mind, that was for certain. And yet the faint traces of the work's author had an alien, almost mechanical feel to them. That he, or she, was not human was a given. That they might not even be alive in a way that humans could understand seemed all too real and disturbing, a possibility. Charles's mistake the night before was to try to pry the blocks loose from Loki's mind with sheer force, accepting some minor discomfort and disorientation on Loki's part as a momentary inconvenience that would surely be outweighed by the relief of being free. But that had failed. A living mind was a vital thing, always shifting and growing. In the same way skin could heal back over wires that had cut deep enough, Loki's thoughts and memories had rearranged themselves around the blockage in his mind. Already they were becoming embedded in his psyche, forming the foundation of how he viewed the world. He built upon them all new disarrays of hurt and resentment and the relentless frustrated hunger for vengeance for an injury he did not even remember. The unknown puppet master had placed Loki in the role of conqueror and destroyer, and Loki had rebuilt his shattered sense of self around that role. Before he could remove the mental blocks, Charles would need to pick apart the convoluted mesh of thoughts and compulsions and grudges that formed his new identity. If he could find a way to bring Loki out of this villainous state of mind he'd mired himself in, then the rest would follow easily. But the first step, and, inevitably, the hardest, would be to gain Loki's trust. He could do nothing without that, not without Loki fighting him at every turn. Loki was a bristling, defensive mass of paranoia and neuroses, snapping at any hand that extended near to him. But Charles was just as determined, and more experienced, impatient. One step at a time. How bold of you, to let loose my hands in such tiny, confined quarters, Loki said softly, settling those hands crossed at the wrist on the table before him. His eyes bored into Charles, wary and calculating. I might go mad again and lash out like a beast. I might strike you, kill you with a blow to your fragile neck before anyone could get near enough to stop me. I don't think that will happen, Charles said truthfully. Loki in his right mind would do no such thing, and Charles didn't intend to do anything that would provoke another irrational episode. He recognized the symptoms now, and would avoid them. He wouldn't give up at removing the blocks from Loki's mind. Not by any means. But he'd learned from his mistakes. He'd have to find a more subtle approach. And what if it did? Loki said, and his voice was carefully and deliberately pitched to reach the microphones. There is no trust in this house. His thoughts flickered, forming and dissolving almost too rapidly for Charles to catch. Separations, differences, schisms, conflicts of loyalty. If I could find those cracks and work at them, elephants, elephants, elephants. Whatever he'd been plotting derailed into a stream of colorful nonsense. Charles considered letting Loki know, in the interests of transparency, that he was really only wasting mental energy in such a pursuit. Charles was quite capable of reading beyond the surface level of a mind at any given time. A thought did not have to be fully formed and verbalized for him to see it and comprehend the meaning behind it. He was as aware of what Loki was deliberately not letting himself think as Loki himself. On the other hand, whatever Loki's intentions in deliberately screening his thoughts this way, the ultimate effect was that he was slowly breaking himself out of the circular habits of angry, destructive thought that had grown to dominate his mental schema. That was an outcome Charles meant to encourage whenever possible, so he made a point of not calling Loki out when his mental soundtrack swerved towards and then away from an unpleasant or malicious place. Loki continued. Would Director Fury even try to stop me, I wonder? Or would he hold back his response just long enough for the deed to be done? How convenient it would be for him, don't you think, if his two enemies struck out at each other, eliminating themselves with no effort needed from him? Tell me, Professor. Do you think the humans would come to your aid? Or would they stand back and allow me to carry out your murder for them? As far as spreading dissension went, it wasn't a bad effort, Charles decided. Even if he could read Loki's intentions, and the relentless projections of his own doubts onto others. Of course Loki did not trust them. Of course Loki would prefer it if his adversaries fought each other. Fury could not. But he refused to rise to Loki's bait, to treat his suggestions as though they had any credibility. Instead, he permitted a small smile to slip onto his face and said, carefully and evenly, a better question, Loki, is whether I would allow such a thing. Loki looked away, discomforted. So tell me, Loki said, more about those humans like yourself. You mean mutants? Charles clarified, intrigued by the question. It was the first time Loki had taken the lead in any of their conversations, and the first time he'd expressed open interest in anything about Earth. Yes, yes. Loki waved one dismissive hand. Whatever you choose to call yourselves. From the perspective of gods, of course, there is very little to choose between one mortal and another, but it seems to mean so much to you. His nonchalant attitude belied the threads of anxiety slipping beneath his thoughts. Unexpected masteries. The Spamark can not only hear secrets but induce paralysis, inflict pain, warp perceptions. What else? I must find out. I am blindfold in this battle. I must learn more, find his weaknesses, find an angle. You speak of mutants as though they are distinct from other mortals, Loki continued. How so? Genetically speaking, they are, Charles answered. Although the expression in each individual is unique, all mutants, what we call Homo superior, as opposed to Homo sapiens, which is the proper name for non-mutant humans, share a modification on their DNA which we call the X gene. The X gene first appeared in what appeared to be spontaneous. Although Loki kept his expression attentive and serious, Charles caught a flash of boredom as his attention began to wander, and cut eel and a headshake. You'll have to excuse my pontification, he said. This is my life's work, you know, so I do tend to ramble on if given an opportunity. I'm sure that given the proper background, you'd have no problem understanding the whole dissertation, but I wouldn't want to bore you. Not at all, Loki lied, and Charles let the polite fiction pass. So you are saying that these, Homo superior, are an entirely separate species, then? For a specific value of the word, species, yes, Charles said evenly. Though most mutants so far have been born to normal human parents, and non-mutants can still have children with mutants. So the variation between the species is not too great, yet, he thought. Loki waved this aside. Most of the races of the 9 realms can breed together, he said dismissively, though not all with equal results, to be sure. I am more interested in learning more about these abilities that you say mutants have. Fear, Charles caught a little of that, if they are all so potent as you. Ambition, if I could build another army of these mutant mortals. What are their strengths? Wariness, if I must fight them someday, what are their weaknesses? But also, beyond these thoughts, a bright spark of plain curiosity. That there was something in the universe so new, so fascinating, that yet he knew nothing of, unbearable. There is a great deal of individual variation, Charles said to that spark of scholarly fascination. Some enhanced abilities seem to be common, strength greater than the average human being, for instance, or faster healing. Many mutants have some kind or another of direct external energetic manipulation, whether of light, or sound, or kinetic force. How it's expressed seems to depend largely upon the individual's formative experiences. Some talents are more powerful than others. A few especially gifted individuals have more than one talent at once, but that's rare. Sparks of godhood, Loki thought. Each individual has only one, like a single shattered fragment of a great spell, and yet if all combined together they might equal the power of a warrior of Asgard. That was certainly a perspective that Charles didn't hear often, and he couldn't stop a faint smile at the sheer hubris evident in Loki's mindset. Some of my most capable students have formed a team, what you might call a troubleshooting squad, he added blandly. With their powers combined, they are quite formidable. He expected Loki to bristle at the challenge, pull up the pride of his warrior culture in response, but to his surprise Loki didn't take the bait. Instead he leaned forward, his eyes intent. They are sworn to your banner, this battalion of heroes? He asked. Do the mutants have their own country, then? Are you their king? Powerful and wise, like Odin King, Loki thought. Yet also, gentle, kind. Not like Odin King. How does a king manage to wield his authority, when crippled with such weakness? I must know. I must learn how. No, Charles said, keeping his voice neutral. I am not a king. At most I am a custodian of my own small lands and those mutants who live under my care there. But there are many more mutants who live outside my boundaries, and mine is not the only faction. Loki pounced on that, his eyes alight. What different factions of mutants are there, then? He asked. Blast, he hadn't meant to admit that. Charles concealed a wince, but answered as conservatively as he could. I believe that mutants should, for the benefit of humanity as a whole, stay on peaceful terms with the parent race, he said. That we should, as much as possible, remain unobtrusive and discreet. There are others who disagree. I would think that your people would be lords among men, compared to other mortals, Loki commented. Powerful men like flattery, the calculation flickered in his mind, they like to be reminded of the power they hold. I'm afraid it's not quite like that, Charles said. Mutants are feared and hated in most human societies. Whatever for? Loki said in astonishment. Really, almost any change would have to be an improvement. Charles shrugged. Not all mutations are benign, or even neutral. Some are harmful, dangerous to the people around them and even to themselves. There have been incidents where a mutant newly coming into his or her powers inflicted quite considerable damage to their surroundings. Most were accidental, but a few could not be said to be accidents. Loki could believe it. Loki did believe it, having come into similar powers, though more through study than through natural causes, during his own tumultuous adolescence. The temptation to use his newly discovered powers to revenge himself on his childhood tormentors had been too much to resist, even if Loki had ever had much of a history of great self-restraint. The All-Father had quickly found out what he was doing and put a stop to it, more was the pity, but his family had still been required to pay a substantial wargild in recompense. It had been worth it. I see you understand, Xavier said. Loki laughed scornfully. Are you mortals really so pathetic, so tiny? He asked incredulously. That you would spurn the most powerful among you? Turn those who should be your greatest allies into enemies? I'm afraid so, Charles said, and leveled a shrewd gaze on Loki. But then, perhaps we aren't the only ones. Are the Aesir really so different? Loki jerked and flushed. Charles knew he'd hit home. That is not the same, he managed, feeling illogically compelled to defend his homeland and people. Asgard upholds strength above all other virtues. It is weakness that is despised. Weakness, or strength which comes in unfamiliar guises. Charles replied. Humans are much the same. Mankind has always feared change, and hated that which was different. There is another group of mutants, led by Eric Lenscher, who calls himself Magneto, which believes, not dissimilarly to you, that mutants are superior, Charles said, as matter of fact as if he were discussing the weather. The earpiece he was wearing gave an unhappy buzz, but Charles ignored it this time. That Homo superior should rightly rule over normal humans, and seeks to lead his mutants to a victory over them. Professor, Fury's tinny voice came over the headset. He normally didn't interrupt during Charles's sessions with Loki. He'd warned Fury to avoid talking on that channel as much as possible, since it was impossible to reduce the volume enough to keep Loki from overhearing it too. Can I ask what you're thinking giving information on radical mutant factions to the supervillain who just tried to take over the Earth? Last thing we want to do is give him inspiration. Charles pressed his lips together and shot back telepathically, this is all publicly available information. If he were free and looking to resume his activities, he could find this out in 10 minutes of research. Hiding or lying information from him won't accomplish anything, nor will acting like Loki taking over the Earth is still a possibility. Loki gave him a bland, innocent smile. He had, of course, heard every word that Fury had spoken over the channel. He sounds like quite an inspirational figure, this Eric Lenscher, he said in a bright tone. Perhaps I should look him up, once I retire from your kind hospitality. Charles snorted and shook his head. I can assure you, it would be a waste of both your time, he said dryly. I once knew Eric quite well. To be quite honest, he's more than a bit of a racist. He would never ally himself with non-mutant humans, let alone an alien from another race entirely. In his own way he's a man of very strict principle, and he would never join forces with someone who did not seek to advance the mutant cause. He was diverted to brood for a few moments on Eric, well aware of the irony of his own airy assurance as to Magneto's motives and methods. How could he claim to speak with any authority over what Eric would and wouldn't do in pursuit of his cause, when he'd lost any influence or restraint over the other man years ago? Yet still this time, the way he'd failed with Eric. The more so because for all Charles had turned his thoughts 1,000 times over each moment, each act, each link in the chain of tragedy, he still couldn't see any other way that it could have ended. Charles and Eric had shared the dream of a new world for mutants. How could he fault Eric for seeking that still? He and Eric were so alike, and yet, in the most critical of ways, so alien to each other. Eric was so very, very convinced of the rightness of his cause, the justness of his methods. There was no way to dissuade him from his path, not without him becoming a wholly different man. And he had been a good man. Charles had believed it still. How could such a good man have committed such terrible evil? This time was different, Charles told himself firmly. This was different. Loki was not Eric, pure and ruthless in his quest for righteousness. Loki was just confused, twisted and hurt in his mind, lashing out in reaction to hurts he had received. There was nothing fundamental to Loki that demanded he unleash evil onto the world, only terrible mistakes. He just needed help, and Charles would help him. This time it would be different. "Why, Professor, you wound me," Loki protested, laying one hand over his heart in a gesture of injured sincerity. "What makes you think I don't have the best interest of mutants in mind? If my stewardship of Midgard had not been so cruelly nipped in the bud, I am sure that I would have had nothing but the highest regard for you and your people. I would have given them the highest stations among warriors, made them the gatekeepers for your realm." It was an interesting bit of logic twisting there, Charles noted. Loki wasn't exactly telling a lie, since his conquest of Earth had never actually come about. He could claim any number of hypotheticals as if they would have been fact. He could even, at least for 5 minutes at a time, convince himself that his claims were completely true. Not that it really mattered, since Charles wasn't the audience here. Fury was. Loki had by now decided that he could neither deceive nor unnerve Charles, and instead focused all his sallies towards building mistrust between the two camps of his captors. He certainly had Fury nailed to rights, the deep-seated paranoia that pervaded the military man's every action. Whether Charles agreed to Loki's proposition or hotly denied it, the seeds of doubt would be planted. So he laughed. "Very noble of you, Loki," he said with a chuckle. "But you'll forgive me if I don't intend to trust the intricacies of human-mutant relations with someone who didn't even know mutants existed a few days ago. I will be content with the allies I have, thank you." Loki sneered at him, slumping down in his chair with his arms crossed over his chest, the very picture of insouciant boredom. "Yes," he drawled, playing for time while his mind raced, Charles sensed, seeking a new angle of attack. "Such allies you have, when you yourself have admitted them to be enemies of all your own people. So very good of you, Professor, to selflessly put your own safety and freedom on the line for the chance to do their bidding. What reward could they possibly offer you? I wonder, that would make it worth it." "I don't really do it for reward," Charles said calmly. "For a teacher, getting to see your students bloom and grow was its own reward. It would have to be, in order to put up with all that came along with it." But that was not a sentiment he would expect Loki to understand, yet. "Tell me, Professor, how do you do it?" Loki asked, leaning forward intently in his chair. "Why do you do it? Why do you continue to aid the humans, after all this time, after all they have done to you and yours, all the struggles and humiliations? Why do you allow them to keep you on the shelf, ignored and disregarded, until they have some use for you, only to reverse their course and come to you, saying of course we need you for the skills that only you possess, to clean up this mess of our own devising? Why do you, when you know that as soon as your usefulness to them is past you will be thrust once again into the shadows? Why do you help them? Why do you not leave them to choke in their own impotence? Why do you not return to them sevenfold the same cruelty and indifference that they heap upon you?" There it was again, Charles reflected. Loki projecting his own issues onto others with furious intensity. And projecting was exactly the word for it. Even with his magic blocked, Loki's psychic strength was not inconsiderable. He generated a mental field that extended quite some distance beyond his own body, filled with a crackling silent litany of whatever was going through his head at the time. Charles wondered if that wasn't the unexpected secret behind Loki's success as a liar, how he got people to believe his lies despite his reputation being widely known. Loki's mental field fed his intended falsehoods into his audience's mind before he even opened his mouth. Most people, lacking Charles's own sensitivity, would not be able to identify the source of the whispering doubts. They would creep in among their own thoughts as though born there naturally, and so when spoken aloud would seem all too plausible. He wondered if all Loki's people had the same ability or if it was unique, a part of his inherent magical abilities. Either way, he didn't seem to be consciously aware of it at all. He also knew perfectly well that he wasn't even the real target of Loki's subtle attack here. It was aimed at the other listeners, hidden behind the microphones and cameras. More of Loki's not very subtle campaign to spread dissension and doubts amongst his enemies, and even if Charles knew very well what he was up to, that was no guarantee that Fury did. And so it was with both his audiences in mind that Charles chose his words very, very carefully when he answered. Because they are our family, he said, the idea stunning in its simplicity. The humans are our kin. Our parents were normal, our grandparents, our aunts and uncles. Most of us have sisters and brothers, cousins and friends who are human. Not all of them are as strange, not all of them have turned their backs on us, and so we can never turn our backs on them. No matter what else happens between humans and mutants, we will always be bound by ties of blood and kinship. We are the future of the human race, but they are its foundation. As much as it is folly for them to try to destroy their own future, we can never forget that it was they who brought us into this world. And let that go on record, he thought. Let that little clip go into the storage banks and be played and replayed and analyzed by top SHIELD operatives for the next 5 years. He had said nothing but the truth and the full sincerity of what he believed. If even one person watching that video would listen, then that alone would make this all worth it.